Hi, how is everybody? Um, I'm welcome to the stream, everybody. I'm gonna be talking about the all-important question of carbon taxes and more broadly environmental policy. But I mean, even carbon taxes alone, as well as like cap and trade and like other kind of alternative or complementary emissions reduction schemes. That could take up a whole research stream or several research streams. So my impression of carbon taxes from light reading is that they are very much a good idea, but I want to kind of test that and see what a good idea they are against other forms of policy. So we can look at some of the evidence for it. So we may start to compile some kind of document that's similar to the cost of living document. Or we may not. Who knows? So yeah, the thing about hello CH22. I'm pretty well. Um yeah. I'm I'm basically fine. I'm a bit aimless at the moment because it's summer and I have been working on my new video script, but you can't just, it's not something that you can necessarily just work on when you want. Like sometimes you just like, I literally have no inspiration, and yesterday was a very inspired day, whereas today was a very uninspired day. Anyway, how are you? Tyler Cross thinks we need to get rid of carbon credits. Well, this is interesting, right? So there's this whole debate about whether things like that just basically end up being like greenwashing, and whether companies just use them to even speculate and things like that. So yeah, how maybe a better maybe a better name for this stream would be like how to reduce carbon. Yes, that is a high resolution wallpaper. So high resolution. It's the highest resolution you'll ever see. Yeah, it's a good point about global carbon emissions, right? Because you get competition. I mean, let's delve right in. So I've got this paper that is recent-ish, 2019, on carbon taxes and CO2 emissions in Sweden. Now, so this is quite localized. It's not about let me just align the text on this screen for everybody. So it's not about a global carbon tax, but it does seem to find a very big effect, which is both encouraging and discouraging because, like, I'm always wary of any big empirical effect in any study. It just screams like, you know, publication bias, right? It just screams like you found this by chance and it's too big to be feasible and all the rest of it. But we need to look at the actual paper a little bit more. So Falsum, I guess. So you're saying there's no hard real-world evidence that carbon tax actually work as advertised. Best you can say is that they drive some minor efficiency improvements and fuel switching, which is an interesting point of view, but I wonder if this paper will shed light on it. I mean, it's a long-ish paper. Well, I mean, all economics papers are long. I don't know that we'll actually read all of it, but I just want to get an idea of like what they're up to. So do carbon taxes work? Do they bloody work? Because it is the default response of economists to climate change. A carbon tax. You see it all the time. If you go to, I don't know what does IGM polls. IGM forum carbon taxes. A tax on the carbon content of fuels would be a less expensive way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions than would a collection of policies such as corporate average fuel economy requirements for automobiles. You can see there it's like strongly agree, like negligible in any other category. Right, everyone's agreeing. See Chris Nittle's forthcoming paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on this topic. Interesting. Wait, have they got another more modern one? That was 2011. 2012. Right, okay, that was slightly more modern. Brookings Institute recently described a US carbon tax of $20 per tonne, increasing at 4% a year, which would raise an estimated $150 billion per year in federal revenues over the next decade. Given the negative externalities created by carbon dioxide emissions, a federal carbon tax at this rate would involve fewer harmful net distortions to the US economy than a tax increase that generated the same revenue by raising marginal tax rates on labour income across the board. All right, that's a very, very economist statement. Of course they're going to agree to that. That's like saying, yeah, because you're taxing what they call an externality, you're not distorting the economy. But I don't really like, yeah. I don't really like, this is a bit more. I'm surprised there aren't. Surprised there aren't more. The European Green Deal. The European Union goal of reaching net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050 will be a major drag on economic growth. Uncertain, disagree, uncertain, disagree. Why is there so little on, like, climate change and stuff? Climate change policies. Considering a broad range of costs and benefits, is a better tool for guiding climate policy than setting temperature limits such as 1.5 degrees centigrade based on expected links between temperature increases and the extent of environmental harm. So either you consider a broad range of costs and benefits or you set temperature limits. I mean, that seems like a false choice. I mean, there's what? A quarter uncertain, almost half agree. Oh, sorry, that was weighted by confidence. There's quite a lot of dispersion in these answers. Maybe a bit too much agree for me. Oh, carbon taxes are a better way to implement climate policy than capping trade. So, you know. Yeah, so, I mean, Acemoglu's right there. There's great urgency. We need a red line, and 1.5 degrees centigrade is as good as any, especially taking into account consequences of greater rises for some areas. Well, at least somebody's got their head screwed on. But, like, yeah, so basically, economists really like carbon taxes. How good are they? It's a good question for us to answer today. Any thoughts on the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism? Not really, but maybe those thoughts will become more coherent as the stream progresses. Too many loopholes. Not all emitting sectors are covered and so on. The caps are too high, allowances are too cheap, sectors are exempt and they have little impact on emissions. Yeah. So, let's read this paper about carbon taxes and learn a little bit more about them. Julius Anderson. This quasi-experimental study is the first to find a significant causal effect of carbon taxes on emissions, empirically analysing the implementation of a carbon tax and a value-added tax on transport fuel in Sweden. After implementation, carbon dioxide emissions from transport declined almost 11%, with the largest share due to the carbon tax alone. relative to a synthetic control unit constructed from a comparable group of OECD countries. Okay, I do not like some synthetic controls. We'll get to that later. Furthermore, the carbon tax elasticity of demand for gasoline is 3 times larger than the price elasticity. Okay, so that's like, I guess people, is that because people know that it's come from a carbon tax, so that it's like a signal? So that's like saying people respond more to the rise in price from the tax than just a rise in the price in general. Is that like, okay, we've implemented the carbon tax, fuel's gone up, and people are like, oh, okay, this means that we should, react. I'm not sure. Interesting. Policy evaluations of carbon taxes using price elasticities to simulate emission reductions may thus significantly underestimate their true effect. What's synthetic control? It's like, so if you imagine that there's like a treatment and a control group, right, in like a usual difference in different studies. So let's say like with the minimum wage, they compared, Card and Kruger in their famous paper compared New Jersey to Pennsylvania. A synthetic control is when you say, okay, we don't have a similar enough control group in the real world, effectively. Like, we don't have for Sweden, we don't have the equivalent for Pennsylvania, right? We don't have we can't compare it to a really nearby neighbor that's really similar. I don't why they didn't choose. I mean, I guess they could have chosen Norway or something, right? I don't know why. Maybe that'll be explained in the paper, but maybe it's actually not similar enough. And then what you do is you take like some kind of combination of similar countries, and you construct your control group like by combining them in some kind of statistical way, right? So in this case, it's the OECD countries. So basically, other rich countries that they've used for a synthetic control. My issue with it is that there are too many researcher degrees of freedom, and people can just like make up a control group that has certain characteristics which leads to a certain conclusion, depending on how they do it. And there are, it depends a lot on the details of the study. Okay. In Paris in 2015, countries renewed their commitment to address climate change. As part of the Paris Agreement, each country put forward a nationally determined contribution toward the common goal of limiting global warming. This bottom-up approach of voluntary pledges will put the focus on national mitigation policies. At the centre of these policies should be an effort to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions such as carbon dioxide by issuing tradable emission permits or through a carbon tax. So that's kind of what we're interested in today, I reckon. This is like the different ways of reducing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, but we'll focus on carbon for now. Where most economists favour a tax, public support for carbon taxes are, however, generally low, and people tend to believe they are environmentally inefficient. Although when provided with evidence that they indeed reduce emissions, the support for carbon taxes increases. Few countries, however, have implemented carbon taxes, and there are, surprisingly, even fewer ex-post empirical studies of their causal effect on emissions to draw from. This is, I think like one of the themes of my streams is going to be pausing every 10 seconds to rant about the economics profession, right? But I believe in a carbon tax, and this paper does seem to be favourable to them. However, the fact that there is such strong support and certainty among economists about carbon taxes when there aren't that many countries that have done them, and out of that, there are even fewer that have empirical studies of their effect on emissions, right? How can you be that certain? Oh, because Econ 101 told me so. Just too much certainty. This lack of empirical studies of carbon taxes is unfortunate given the urgency of tackling climate change, and relying on less efficient measures will make it hard to reach current targets under the Paris Agreement. Not to mention the even more ambitious abatement targets that are needed if we are serious about curbing warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Correctly estimating the effectiveness of carbon taxes empirically is thus important for shoring up much needed public support, as well as ensuring that environmentally and economically efficient mitigation policies are adopted across countries by the diffusion of lessons from existing national climate policies. I investigate empirically the environmental efficiency of carbon taxes by analysing the Swedish experience of introducing a carbon tax on transport fuels in the early 1990s. Sweden was one of the first countries in the world to implement a carbon tax in 1991. It was introduced at the level of US $30 per tonne of CO2 and then successively increased to today's rate of $132, currently the highest carbon tax in the world. In the year prior, in March of 1990, Sweden also extended the coverage of its existing value-added tax to include gasoline and diesel. The VAT rate of 25% is applied to all components of the retail price, the production cost of the transport fuel, producer margin, and any added excise taxes. So Sweden basically taxes the crap out of carbon, and in particular carbon emissions from cars, right? Or any vehicle that uses gasoline and diesel, because they'll get double taxed, right? They'll get the value added tax and the carbon tax. The Swedish carbon tax mainly affects the transport sector. Today, around 90% of the revenues from the carbon tax comes from the consumption of gasoline and motor diesel. That is a lot. When implemented, large sectors of the economy, especially industry and agriculture, received a considerably lower carbon tax rate because of concerns of international competitiveness and carbon leakage, and fuels used for electricity production were fully exempted from paying the tax. Wait. Right, so it's not a full carbon tax. So it is basically a tax on, like, cars. If fuels used for electricity production were fully exempted from paying the tax. So this is exactly what you were talking about someone earlier with competitiveness, right? You just end up with these loopholes. In addition, in 1991, the energy tax on fossil fuels was reduced by 50% for industry, leading to a combined tax rate that was slightly lower than before the reform. What? In fact, the Swedish EPA analysed all sectors that were covered by the carbon tax and found that, besides transport, it was only for heating that the carbon tax had an effect on emissions. I expect the impact on heating to have been small, however, as in 1991, only around 37% of heating fuels were fossil fuel based. Furthermore, a reduction in the energy tax rate meant that the total tax for heating oil was on the whole almost unaffected by the introduction of the carbon tax. The transport sector, though, is fully covered by the carbon tax, and thus a suitable sector to analyse. It is also Sweden's largest source of CO2 emissions. From 1990 to 2005, the sector was responsible for close to 40% of total annual CO2 emissions. Wait. So, from transport, okay. So this is all transport, right? This is transport. In the first half of this paper, I estimate empirically the reduction of CO2 emissions in the transport sector using panel data and the synthetic control method. From a carefully chosen control group of OECD countries, I construct the counterfactual synthetic Sweden, a comparable unit consisting of a weighted combination of countries that did not implement carbon taxes or similar policies during the treatment period, and that prior to treatment resembles Sweden on a number of key predictors of CO2 emissions in the transport sector and have similar levels and paths of those emissions. Okay. The synthetic control method provides an estimated emission reduction from the transport sector of 10.9% or 2.5 million metric tons in an average year during 1990 to 2005, the chosen post-treatment period of interest in this paper. In the second half of this paper, I disentangle the carbon tax and VAT effect by first estimating tax and price elasticities of demand for gasoline in Sweden. To this end, I use time series analysis of the consumption and price of gasoline in Sweden during 1970 to 2011, exploiting yearly changes to the carbon tax rate and the carbon tax exclusive price of gasoline, the total gas price minus the carbon tax. I find that the carbon tax elasticity of demand is around 3 times larger than the price elasticity. Using the estimated carbon tax and price elasticities, together with the estimated emission reductions from using the synthetic control method, I then disentangle the effect of the carbon tax on emissions from the effect of the VAT. From the carbon tax... Okay, so basically, yeah. They're splitting out the effects of the carbon tax and the effects of, like, the rise in prices, right? And the rise in prices is assumed to have the same effect as a rise in VAT. So they're two types of different... It's a bit like some of the work that Raj Shetty's done on, like, tax salience, because it's like carbon tax is like big, like, here's a carbon tax, your fuel price has gone up, whereas VAT can be a bit more hidden. It's kind of worked into the production costs of firms and stuff, and they'll increase prices, but the price, the price increase could have happened for a lot of reasons. So consumers just kind of think of it in a different way, if you understand what I'm saying. From the carbon tax alone, I estimate a post-treatment reduction of 6.3% or 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 emissions in an average year. This result is in contrast to earlier empirical studies that find no effect from the Swedish carbon tax on domestic transport CO2 emissions. So 2 studies have found no effect. Bolin 1998, Lin and Lee 2011. And the estimated reduction is 40% larger than an earlier simulation study finds. In fact, my finding differs from all earlier empirical studies of carbon taxes, which find that the taxes have had very small to no effect on CO2 emissions in the countries that implemented them. This is thus the first quasi-experimental study to find a significant causal effect of a carbon tax on emissions. So what methods did these use? I guess we'll find out. Right, so this is why, right, this level of certainty really, really annoys me. Because I'm coming in and I want to support carbon taxes. I want to support anything that's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. I don't care what type of policy it is. I don't care if it's a tax policy, if it's like a free market deregulation policy. I don't care if it's like, more of a community-based policy. I don't care if it's like private sector initiatives. Like, if it works, The environment doesn't care about politics. I'm willing to support pretty much any policy. But then you get everybody like, oh, a carbon tax is the best way to reduce emissions. Well, clearly not, right? Because while this study does find a reduction, these 3, a reduction in emissions from carbon taxes, these 3 don't. So why is there this level of certainty? Right. We're at the beginning, so we'll move on before I get too annoyed. There are a number of advantages to using the synthetic control method when it comes to evaluating the environmental effects of carbon taxation. First, with the synthetic control method, we use ex-post empirical data on CO2 emissions as the outcome variable, and there is thus no need to use a simulation approach to estimate changes to emissions. So, yeah, this is actually data, whereas a simulation approach is obviously not data-based or, minimally data-based. It might be kind of fitted to data. So this is better. I feel confident in saying this is better. I would believe this more than the simulation approach that didn't find much reduction. Earlier studies of the environmental effect of carbon taxes, or transport fuel taxes in general, are typically ex ante or ex post simulations, using price elasticities of demand for gasoline to estimate reductions in consumption of transport fuel. Changes to the consumption of gasoline are in these studies used as a proxy for total changes in CO2 emissions from the transport sector or the economy as a whole. Okay. Right, okay, so yeah, I'm going to continue because he's listing the issues with the previous approaches, which is helpful. There are, however, a number of problems with this simulation approach. There is now growing evidence that consumers respond more strongly to tax changes compared to equivalent price changes, especially in the gasoline market. A number of studies find that the tax elasticity is 2.5 to 4 times larger than the price elasticity. Simulations that use price elasticities of demand thus underestimate the true causal effect of carbon taxes on CO2 emissions. Furthermore, by focusing on changes in demand for only gasoline, these earlier studies don't account for substitution between fuels, most notably from gasoline to diesel, as well as a substitution between modes of transport. Right, you tax fuels, people switch. They buy different fuel, they use different forms of transport. And previous studies don't account for this, apparently. In Europe, the share of passenger cars using diesel as engine fuel is in many countries equal to the share that uses gasoline. I didn't know that. I thought diesel cars were much rarer. This is a different situation compared with the United States and Canada, where gasoline is overwhelmingly the main fuel used in passenger cars. That might be true in the UK as well. When they say Europe, I think they're thinking like mainland Europe. The increased share of diesel in Europe is an important form of adaptation to higher fuel taxes, since the diesel engine offers significantly better fuel efficiency. The difference in the vehicle fleet between Europe and North America may thus be seen as a direct response to comparatively higher fuel taxes in Europe. In Sweden, the percentage of passenger cars using diesel in 1991 was 2.7%. This share increased to 5.2% in 2005 and 29.6% in 2015. This substitution is important to capture when evaluating the effect of environmental taxation in the transportation sector, as a failure to do so will bias the results. Thanks for subscribing, Rick. Yeah, left-hand path, I completely agree. With how much people advocate for carbon taxes, I would have thought that there was enough data that supported the idea that they're effective as well. Like, this is the problem, right? This is the problem with policy. You know, you've got a lot of people who are self-appointed policy experts. And then you ask them, you know, you go into, oh, why do you believe that? Oh, well, they believe it because of an introductory economics textbook. Or they believe it because of an IGM poll of some economists. And I'm not saying those things are always wrong. I'm saying that you need to look deeper. And you know, I don't have opinions on policy really, not strong opinions anyway, until I've read like a whole bunch of papers about them. And I want to know like exactly how they've done it, you know, like I want to know the methods, right? I want to know the data, I want to know the country it's in, the time period it's in, the limitations, how it fits into other similar studies. An additional benefit of looking at transport emissions directly is that we capture all fuel demand adjustments made on the extensive margin in response to a carbon tax, such as an increased use of public transport. Okay, total transport emissions, yeah, allows for substitution effects, basically. Buses used for public transport typically use diesel as engine fuel. Second, in the setting of this paper, with only one treated unit and the use of aggregated data, the synthetic control method has some advantages over the difference in differences estimator frequently used in comparative case studies. Besides simulations, the use of the DID estimator is the most common research design in evaluations of the effects of carbon taxes. To begin with, the synthetic control method relaxes the parallel trends assumption that underlies the DID estimator by allowing the effects of unobserved confounders on emissions to vary over time. Right. Because... Okay, I'm not sure I quite grasp that yet. Let's just soldier on because this is quite a technical paragraph. I don't know why that's the case, but I'm sure it'll be explained later. Furthermore, with the inclusion of predictors of CO2 emissions from the transport sector, we weigh the units in the control group so as to create a comparison unit that most resembles Sweden. Addition of these covariates such as level of urbanization and number of motor vehicles per capita is not possible in the DID regression as they are lightly affected by the implementation of the carbon tax, themselves being outcome variables, and are thus considered bad controls. Hey, Jordan Peterson, you should read this paper. You might learn a little bit about bad controls. Yeah, so you don't want to include city density or urbanization or whatever it is, number of motor vehicles, cars per person, because that's an outcome. We want to ideally we want to reduce or somehow change that via a carbon tax, right? So if you're like controlling for that, then you're controlling for how the carbon tax works. With the synthetic control method, we use the predictive power of the covariates to construct a convincing counterfactual without the confounding effect of having them included post-treatment. But with DID, there is also often an ambiguity in the choice of comparison units, whereas the synthetic control method chooses them through a data-driven method. Lastly, in the synthetic control framework, the relative contribution of each control unit is made explicit, and we can analyze the similarities or lack thereof between our selected synthetic control and the treated unit on the pre-intervention outcomes and observable predictors of the post-intervention outcomes. But isn't that also true of difference in differences? Oh, it doesn't matter. Like that. I won't get too bogged down in this type of stuff. In addition to the merits of using empirical ex-post data on emissions and a synthetic control, I like the first page or two of this paper were actually quite readable, and now it's got into the technical stuff. But I think we're gonna get like a history of the Swedish carbon tax soon, so I think this bit's a little bit dense. Yeah. My paper contributes to the empirical lecture on carbon taxation on a few other dimensions. First, Sweden's geographical location makes it less susceptible to carbon leakage from the transport sector, leaving estimated emissions restrictions unbiased. Sweden is a peninsula in the most northern region of Europe, only sharing land border with Norway along a depopulated area of Sweden. Interesting. Gasoline prices in Norway are also, on average, 15% higher than in Sweden during the post-treatment period, making cross-border shopping of fuel by Swedes unlikely. This is a different situation than, for instance, the carbon tax that was implemented in British Columbia, Canada in 2008, studied in Rivers and Shofele, and Elgee and Maclay. The British Columbia is surrounded by other Canadian states and the United States in 3 out of 4 directions. There is thus an obvious risk of carbon leakage, evidence of which is reported in Antweiler and Galati. Okay, so you can't get out of Sweden, basically. That's the message of that paragraph. There is no escape from Sweden. You will buy the Swedish fuel and you will drive around using it. Second, since Sweden implemented a carbon tax as early as 1991, my paper is better able to capture long-term changes to behaviour. The 16 years of post-treatment data in my study can be compared with the 4 years in Rivers and Shofele. Yeah, it's a long time. It's a long-term paper, which is good. Although we might be interested in short-term changes, right, in practice. Do we have 16 years? We don't have any years as far as I'm concerned. The UK was on fire a little while ago, and it's one of the countries that's doing about the best in terms of climate change. Canada does not have states. What does it have if it doesn't have states? Yeah, I've completely forgotten the name for them. Do you just say regions? Municipalities? What is it that Canada calls its areas? Provinces, that's it. Fucking hell. Of course it's provinces, yeah. Canadian states. There you go. There you go, it's changed. Fuel demand adjusts in response to a carbon tax on two different margins. The intensive changes in mileage. Oh, the intensive margin changes in mileage driven, and the extensive buying a more fuel efficient car or using alternative transportation means such as public transport or a bicycle. With Sweden as our case study, we are able to capture adjustments made on both of these margins. Yeah, so people drive less and they also drive different. Hello, left hand. Wait, no, sorry. Hello. Yeah, Zhao. I'm not sure how to say that. Sorry, Victor. So, Sweden. What is Sweden? Sweden is a small open economy with a population of 9.5 million and a nominal GDP per capita that ranked it as the 11th richest country in the world in 2015. With regard to climate change policies, in 1991, Sweden was one of the first countries in the world to implement a carbon tax. The tax was first suggested by the Social Democrats in 1988, citing the threat of climate change, and signed into law by the Social Democratic government in 1990. The full carbon tax rate is levied on heating fuels used by households and transport fuels. Measures to combat climate change have broad political support in the late 80s and early 90s, but concerns about international competitiveness and carbon leakage meant the industry only paid 25% of the full rate. This differential has changed over the years. Industry paid from 21 to 50% of the general carbon tax rate in the years 1991 to 2005, and today industry pays 80% of the full rate. Owing to the lower rate paid and coupled with a reduction in the existing energy tax and a relatively small reliance on fossil fuels, less than 30% for the energy supply, the impact of carbon tax on the Swedish industry has been rather limited. Wait, so Sweden already only uses... Whoops, wrong thing. Sweden already only uses less than 30%. Its energy supply is provided by more than 70% non-fossil fuels. So why is that, though? I mean, that is a good question. Why is that? Like, the starting point here for Sweden is much better than I think a lot of other countries. And then they're implementing a carbon tax, even if it is slightly problematic. But then how did they get there? The carbon tax was introduced at $30 per ton of CO2 and increased slightly during the 1990s to $44 in 2000. Then, from 2001 to 2004, the rate was increased in a step-by-step manner to $109. Today, in 2018, the rate is $132 per ton of CO2, the world's highest CO2 tax imposed on non-trading sectors and households. The final tax rates applied to fossil fuels are set in accordance with their carbon content. For example, the combustion of 1 litre of gasoline releases 2.323 kg of CO2. The carbon tax rate of 0.25 Swedish krona, is that? Per kg of CO2, blah blah blah, in 1991, that's equated to an addition to the consumer price of gasoline of 0.58 SEK per litre, where 1 SEK is US dollar 12 cents, sorry. 12 cents in US dollars. Right, so that's like 8 cents, 7 cents. $0.07, and how much? So that's 7 cents on a, well, I don't know what you call the decimals of the Swedish currency, but the 7 cents added to, we don't know what the original price was. They haven't told us. Okay. But that's what the carbon tax adds. When the carbon tax was implemented, it complemented an existing energy tax that was added to the price of gasoline as early as 1924 and diesel in 1937. With the addition of VAT of 25% in 1990, the retail price of gasoline and diesel today consists of a tax-exclusive price PT, energy tax T TAU T energy, carbon tax TAU T CO2, and a value-added tax. So this is the total. You've actually got the price, the energy tax, and the carbon tax, all times by VAT. The Swedes bloody love their taxes, don't they? Heroes. Taxes are good. Their cents are called ore. Ah, thank you very much. How do I say that with the two dots as well? Is there a way of pronouncing that? Or something? I don't know. Figure 1, panel A, shows that the real inflation-adjusted energy tax applied to gasoline was fairly constant from 1990 to 2000, before decreasing in the years 2001 to 2005. Panel A. Energy tax. So that's, that stays constant, and then the gasoline price is also constant. And then this is where the VAT and the carbon tax. Wait. I don't understand this. So black is gasoline price. Grey is energy tax. Dot dash is VAT, which I think is this one. But that, okay, so that makes it look like carbon taxes. For fuck's sake. Journals. This is like, what is it? AEJ policy? AEJ applied? American Economic Journal, economic policy. The fucking leaders of the economics profession. Sort out your figures. Right, so that is dash. That is just a dash. But obviously it looks exactly the same as the gasoline price. So the carbon tax is this just dashed one. So that came in here, right, as it told us before in the history. Honestly. Why is everything so annoying? Everything's just like not done properly. Can you imagine how irritating having your paper marked by me is? Okay, so this decrease was counteracted by a simultaneous increase in the carbon tax rate, sustaining the upward trend in the total tax, as evident in Figure 1. Yeah, so there was a slight decline here, but then the other taxes came in. So there's a sort of gradual decline there, and then it more than compensated for by the rise in carbon tax and energy tax. Carbon tax and VAT, sorry. So there's been a shift, basically, to a different type of... more tax and different tax. From, what, 1960 to 2000. 2005. The total tax rate increased by 39% in 1990 and more than 82% between 1989 and 2005, from over 4 Swedish krona to over 7 per litre. Figure 2 plots per capita consumption of gasoline and diesel during 1960 to 2005. The figure gives us a descriptive indication that the carbon tax and VAT had an impact on the consumption of transport fuel and that consumers substituted gasoline for diesel in response to the large increase in taxes. So gasoline price and total tax on panel B, they're moving kind of in tandem, right? Well, not exactly, but like that's kind of flat. The total tax and the gasoline price is a bit more volatile for obvious reasons. Gasoline prices are volatile, but then they go up together, right? Because the tax is increasing the price. That makes sense. So, road sector fuel. So on the y-axis here, right, we've got road sector fuel consumption per capita, kg of oil equivalent. And then we've got time on the x-axis. So the VAT and carbon tax were implemented here, and you see so there was already a steady trend in diesel upwards, and then it increases a bit faster. Yeah, it increases a bit faster, I'd say. I mean, it's difficult to say. There's a bit of uncertainty there, really, whether the increase in diesel was because of the carbon tax, which was implemented here. The decrease in gasoline is more obvious, though, right? Look at this in black: gasoline up, 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 up. Tax implemented down, 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 down. Right? I mean, it's like, sure, let's do all the fancy econometrics, but like, tell me a different reason that gasoline consumption went down. It seems like pretty likely that it's because of the tax. Yeah, JDM. It's more fuel efficient. I don't know whether diesel's worse for the environment, like blanket. Oh, so Mute says, fun fact: modern diesel is cleaner than gasoline due to strict regulation. That's interesting. Diesel going up because and back, if I'm saying your name right, diesel's going up because people are switching to it. They're switching to cars and vehicles that use diesel over gasoline because gasoline is taxed much more after this period. Hey, you're all talking about buses. Remember when I said I didn't say I'd make a video about buses. I just indicated that I could do. And then I didn't. It's fine though, maybe one day. I love buses. We should look at buses in Nottingham, UK. Their bus system is like on point. I do think I prefer trains, but obviously like they have different purposes. An important question for our subsequent analysis of the effect on emissions is to what extent fuel taxes are borne by consumers. If the carbon tax is fully passed through to consumers, that will result in higher prices at the fuel pump, and higher prices reduce demand and thus fuel use, resulting in lower CO2 emissions from the transport sector. Furthermore, if tax changes are fully passed on to consumers, we can view estimated tax elasticities as demand elasticities. I analyse empirically the question of tax incidence by decomposing the Swedish retail price of gasoline into oil prices and excise taxes. Using first differences, I regress the nominal tax-inclusive price of gasoline, right, prices with taxes during time period T, on the crude oil price and excise taxes. So the effect of increases in so the retail price of gasoline is P star T. This is the price of crude oil, right? As you know, so the input, basically the cost for producers of gasoline, and tau is the sum of the energy and carbon tax. There's no VAT in this model. I'm not 100% sure why. So what is the effect of these things on the price, which is these alphas, alpha 1, alpha 2, right? Just to make that a little bit clear that yeah. Can we do some drawing? I don't want to mess it up. Okay. Using yearly data from 1970 to 2015, I find an estimate for the coefficient on taxes of 1.15. 95% confidence interval of 0.9 to 1.39. The coefficient is statistically indistinguishable from 1, and the data thus indicate that tax changes are borne heavily by consumers. Furthermore, I split up total tax into its energy and carbon tax part. The result stays unchanged, the coefficients being 1.17 for the nominal energy tax and 1 for the nominal carbon tax, both statistically indistinguishable from 1. Changes to the Swedish energy and carbon taxes are thus both fully passed through to consumers, a result similarly found in the studies of US gasoline taxes by, among others, these authors: Marion and Murlega, Davis and Killian, Lee, Lin, and Murlega. Right. So the taxes basically get entirely passed on to consumers, is just what that kind of preliminary regression has showed. Isn't delta P star the change in price? Yeah. Delta P star is the change in price. So it's like they've got the changes of all these variables. So yeah, you're right. I wasn't precise enough with my language. Technically, what they're doing is like doing the changes in all the variables, and that hopefully eliminates like kind of fixed differences that will be associated with both the independent and dependent variables. So yeah, they've differenced them, all of them. Okay, empirical methodology and data. To empirically analyse the effect on emissions from the environmental tax reform in 1990 to 1991, I use annual panel data on per capita CO2 emissions from transport for the years 1960 to 2005 for 25 OECD countries, including Sweden. The outcome variable is measured in metric tons, and the data, taken from the World Bank, contains emissions from the combustion of fuel taken to be equal to the fuel sold from road, rail, domestic navigation, and domestic aviation, excluding international aviation and international marine bunkers. For all the OECD countries in my sample, transport emissions are calculated based on empirical data on the sale of transport fuels and their carbon content, with the data typically available from national statistical agencies. For road vehicles, emissions are attributed to the country where the fuel is sold, right? By focusing on CO2 emissions from the combustion of all transport fuels, not only gasoline, we capture changes in demand for fuel in the different modes of transport, as well as substitutions made between fuels, most notably between gasoline and diesel. So yeah, if you were just looking at just gasoline, right, then you would overestimate the reduction in emissions because people might switch from gasoline to diesel because of the carbon tax, and that would mean that they were still emitting, maybe less, I'm not sure, but they might be emitting more. We haven't decided whether diesel's more efficient, but they're emitting anyway, so you don't want to overestimate that effect. I choose 2005 as the end date because that year was the start of the European Union emissions trading system, one of the main building blocks of the EU's climate change policy. So that may be something we want to look at, right? And also because many countries in the sample implemented carbon taxes or made marked changes to fuel taxation from 2005 and onward. The sample period hence gives me 30 years of pre-treatment data and 16 years of post-treatment data, which is sufficient to construct a viable counterfactual and enough time post-treatment to evaluate the effect of the policy changes. From this initial sample of 25 OECD countries, I exclude countries that during the sample period enacted carbon taxes that cover the transport sector. In this case, Finland, Norway, and the Netherlands, or made large changes to fuel taxes which exclude Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Additionally, I exclude Austria and Luxembourg because of fuel tourism, distorting their emissions data. Austria's emissions data is skewed from the year 1999 and onward. This is due to Austria lowering fuel taxes in 1999 while neighbouring Germany and Italy increased their fuel taxes in the same year. Austria is a major transit country and large trucks in particular tend to fill up in countries with low diesel prices on their way through Europe. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so they've omitted basically countries which are just like where people are traveling through them and they have really low taxes and then people fill up loads. So they have, if you measure it by like the number of vehicles that are filled up in that country, then you get a really high estimate because countries that are vehicles that are going from one country to another have filled up loads. So that's why Austria, Luxembourg, Austria and Luxembourg are omitted. I omit Turkey, which had average per capita emissions in the pre-treatment period way below the other countries in the sample. Lastly, I exclude Ireland because of their unique economic expansion in the 90s. The Celtic Tiger that more than doubled their GDP per capita and CO2 emissions per capita from transport during the post-treatment period. This rapid economic expansion is dissimilar to Sweden's and the other donor countries' development during the same period. Note, however, my main results are robust to these emissions. Right, this is all very technical. So, what bothers me about this, right? So, when we're trying to estimate the effect of a policy, we're just comparing it, right? We're looking at somewhere where the policy is implemented, and we're comparing it to somewhere where the policy wasn't implemented. And our hope is that the place that the policy wasn't implemented is similar enough to the place where the policy that was implemented that we can actually come to some kind of credible conclusion. But if you're excluding countries that enacted carbon taxes, now I can understand why you're doing that. Obviously, you can't compare it. You can't. They've both got carbon taxes, right? I mean, you could, if there were different levels, you might be able to compare that, which could be interesting. But Finland, Norway, and the Netherlands, you would, in my opinion, you would expect those countries to be the most similar to Sweden, right? Because they're countries who care about the environment enough to enact that tax, and that you can see, from casual observation, Finland, Norway, and the Netherlands, yes, these countries are quite similar to Sweden, right? In some of their policies, we know they are, especially Finland and Norway, but the Netherlands too. So these are like the most similar countries, right? There's no Denmark in there. I mean, Denmark's still included in the whole group, but you've got, like someone said, you've excluded like a whole load of countries, and you've got a selected sample of countries here on numerous criteria. This is why I don't like synthetic controls. Do you remember when I said I didn't like synthetic controls? Do you remember that whole thing? It's just like, oh, I did all this stuff, and obviously, like, a lot of it's going to affect the conclusions. I'm not saying there aren't decent reasons in here, but I'm just saying maybe if you did it a different way with equally decent reasons, then you'd come to a different conclusion. So let's take a look at this. So they've constructed this like synthetic control, right? So-called synthetic control. These 14 rich countries that are similar from Sweden in some way. So metric tons per capita CO2. And here they have, in Sweden, the solid black line. It's gone up, up, up. And as we know, when the VAT and carbon tax were implemented, it took a hit and then maybe rose slightly. But it's, you know, it's roughly the same in 2005 as it was in like 1988. Whereas for the dashed line, the OECD sample, it's gone up. It's continued to basically go up at pretty much the same rate. So you can see this difference is on first inspection the effect of the carbon tax on metric tons of per capita CO2 from transport, on emissions from transport. So that's all quite technical stuff. Where does he reference figure 3? Figure 3? Figure 3, because I want to look at the explanation of it. Go on. Alright, let's skip to the results section, because the technical stuff about synthetic controls is obviously inaccessible to a lot of people. So figure 3 is the result, yeah. Figure 3 shows the trajectory of emissions from transport in Sweden and the average of the 14 OECD countries during the sample period. Overall, before 1990, emissions seem to follow a similar trend, but the fit is poor in the 1980s. A statistical analysis shows that on average, from 1960 to 1989, emissions in Sweden and the OECD average grew at a similar pace. Between 1980 and 1989, however, emissions in Sweden grew twice as fast, a difference in trend that is statistically significant. This result indicates that the common trends assumption underlying the difference in differences estimator is violated, and that the result, if we used the DID framework, would be biased. So let's turn to the synthetic control method and see if it produces more promising results. So the point of this is that this is quite a crude comparison, and they've just averaged all of the countries that have been selected. And then actually it turns out that they're not similar enough, right? That there was too much growth. If you say, I think he's referring to here, this black line. If you look at how fast that rises, right, compared to the rise of the dashed line, it's much more steady, much slower. They're saying that means that the groups weren't moving in the same way beforehand, so you can't assume that they would have moved the same way in the absence of the policy. Therefore, they're not a good control group. Does that make sense, everyone, right? Like, you need them to be really similar, basically. And they're not similar enough. So this is the actual proper result, I think, figure 4. Figure 3 shows the trajectory of emissions from transport in Sweden and the average of the 14 OECD countries during the sample period. Overall, before 1990, emissions seem to... Oh, sorry, I've just read that. What am I doing? Sorry, we got to part A. If Synthetic Sweden is able to track CO2 emissions from transport in Sweden in the pre-treatment period and reproduce the values of the key predictors, it lends credibility to our identification assumption that the synthetic control unit provides the path of emissions from 1990 to 2005 in the absence of taxes. So you can see here, right, what's happened is that Sweden and synthetic Sweden are really, really similar, right? So when they've used the fancy synthetic control method, right, they're almost indistinguishable on inspection. They're just evolving the same emissions in these countries. Well, in Sweden and synthetic Sweden. Whereas here, yeah, sure, they're not too dissimilar, but like there are differences, right? There are clear differences. Synthetic Sweden is a combination of the countries that have been selected, right? So remember when we went through that whole bit where he was talking about why he selected those countries? Some countries and not others. Synthetic Sweden is when you combine those in a way that is determined by like the data and the best possible weighting of each country. So synthetic Sweden might be like, I don't know, 0.3 times Denmark plus, 0.15 times Greece plus 0.4 times Spain or something like that. Synthetic Sweden. It's a great place to live. Figure 4 shows that prior to treatment, emissions from transport in Sweden and its synthetic counterpart track each other closely. An average absolute difference of only about 0.03 metric tons of CO2. Hence, the synthetic control doesn't underestimate the treatment effect in the way that the DID estimator does by failing to capture the trend in the last 10 years before treatment. Furthermore, Table 1 compares the values of the key predictors for Sweden prior to 1990 with the same values for synthetic Sweden and a population-weighted average of the 14 OECD countries in the donor pool. For all predictors, except gasoline consumption per capita, Sweden and its synthetic version have almost identical values and a much better fit compared with the OECD average. It is especially encouraging to see the good fit on GDP per capita. So yeah, CO2. So Sweden, GDP per capita, 20,121. What? I don't know what that is. In US, 2005 US dollars. That's GDP per capita. Oh, before tax. Oh, that's like 1989. 1989. That's why it's so low. I was really confused. Why is GDP per capita in Sweden $20,000? Okay. So yeah, synthetic Sweden, motor vehicles very similar, gasoline consumption very similar, urban population 83.1, 83.1. You get the picture. They've made them look similar, so they've got their kind of artificially or synthetically constructed control group to compare real Sweden to. So here's the country weights in synthetic Sweden, right? So remember what I was saying? So Australia, we got a tiny bit of Australia, just like, I don't know, Ayers Rock. We got a good amount of Belgium. Almost a fifth Belgium. No surprises, over a third Denmark. No France, no Canada. Good news on the no France. 0.09 Greece, 0.001 Iceland. That's surprising, actually. I would expect Iceland to be weighted. No Japan. That's not that surprising, right? No Portugal, no Spain. Yeah, about a sixth New Zealand. A tiny amount of Poland. About a 20th Switzerland. And, I don't know. What's that, like a 12th United States? So yeah, this is our Frankenstein's monster of countries that we call synthetic Sweden. And they use like, it's not arbitrarily selected. It's selected using kind of statistical tools. Yeah, we finally got rid of France, everybody. We should all be happy about that. Unfortunately, it took Canada with it too. And I liked Canada, but you know. Yeah, so blah blah blah. So gap in metric tons, so gap emissions from transport. Right, so this is just the gap, right? In emissions, right? So remember here, in figure 4, we've got this gap, you can see it. Now let's just plot the gap. So obviously there's virtually none before the VAT and carbon tax, and then it drops, right? So it seems like there's been a big effect if you believe this this synthetic control approach. Wait, so let's... I just might... So people are asking how it comes to the weight. So we're going to go back, because I didn't want to go in cold with the methodology section. But now we might have a better idea of what we're doing, right? B, the synthetic control method. The DID estimator, commonly used in comparative case studies, constructs the counterfactual using an unweighted average of the outcome variable for the control group from the control group. An estimate of the emission reduction, the treatment effect, is gained by comparing the change in the outcome pre and post treatment for the treated unit and the control group. What makes the DID estimator attractive for comparative studies is that by taking time differences, it eliminates the influence of unobserved covariates that predict the outcome variable, assuming that the outcome variables are constant over time. Assuming that the effects on the outcome variable are constant over time. Sorry. A further assumption is that any macroeconomic shocks or other time effects are common to the treated unit and the control group. Together, these two assumptions are usually referred to as the parallel trends assumption, implying in our case that, in the absence of a carbon tax and VAT, CO2 emissions from the transport sector in Sweden and our control group follow parallel paths. The parallel trends assumption is difficult to verify, which is a drawback for the difference in differences method. It is sometimes possible pre-treatment by analysing the trends of the outcome variable, but obviously impossible after treatment. When the treated unit and the control group do not follow a common trend, the DID estimator will be biased. Therefore, finding a method that relaxes the parallel trends assumption is preferable for comparative case studies. The synthetic control method allows the effects of unobserved confounders on the outcome variable to vary over time by weighting the control group so that prior to treatment it resembles Sweden on a number of key predictors of CO2 emissions in the transport sector and has similar levels and paths of emissions. Thus, by relaxing the parallel trends assumption, the synthetic control method improves on the DID estimator. Right, so I told you this was technical, right? But we're going to try and make sense of it because people are wondering like why the choices were made in this paper the way they were made. So let me just read this again. The synthetic control method allows the effects of unobserved confounders, things we can't measure, on the outcome variable, emissions, to vary over time by weighting the control group, so that prior to treatment it resembles Sweden on a number of key predictors of CO2 emissions in the transport sector and has similar levels and paths of emissions. Thus, by relaxing the parallel trends assumption, the synthetic control method improves upon the DID estimator. So, because you've got this kind of sample that's constructed from a whole bunch of different countries, things can change in those countries after the carbon tax is implemented, right? So after the carbon tax is implemented, things can change in those countries. And if you've got a synthetic control, the fact that things change in those countries will have a knock-on effect on stuff, including emissions. Okay? In contrast, in the difference in differences estimation, you're assuming that things would just continue basically as they did before. I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced by this. Because I mean, okay, yeah, it's not the same assumption, but there's still assumptions in there, right? You have to assume that the synthetic control group continues to resemble, synthetic Sweden continues to resemble real Sweden, and the effects are on carbon emissions of these unobservables are the same. So it's not the parallel trends assumption, but it is an assumption. Maybe it's a weaker assumption. I'm not 100% sure though. Let J plus 1 be the number of OECD countries in my sample indexed by J, and let J equals 1 denote Sweden, the treated unit. The units in the sample are observed for time periods t equals 1, 2 to t, big T, and it is important to have data on a sufficient amount of time periods prior to treatment 1, 2 to t0, as well as post-treatment t0 plus 1. Okay, so they're calling t0 is where the treatment takes place, or just before the treatment takes place. T0 plus 1 is just after the treatment takes place. And T is like the final year. So in our case, that's 2005, right? And the tax is 1990 or 1991. That's 1990, I think that's 1991. To be able to construct a synthetic Sweden and evaluate the effect of the treatment, synthetic Sweden is constructed as a weighted average of the control countries, J equals 2, yeah, so not including 1, which is Sweden, J equals 2 to J plus 1, and represented by a vector of weights, W equals blah, 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 right, you know. This is just where economists suffocate you with notation. It doesn't matter, right? Forget about T and J and W, right? You're weighting, we saw the weights for the countries, you're weighting them. We know that there's a whole list of countries. That's the J's. Doesn't matter. They don't need to be called J. And there's treatment years. There's before the treatment and there's after the treatment. And there's the first period and there's the final period. This is ridiculous. Get coffee. I mean, coffee actually makes it more difficult for me personally to concentrate on this type of thing. But yeah, get coffee if you need it. This is a short. By the way, this isn't a long section. We're gonna get to like. I just want to learn a bit about carbon taxes, but this is important because obviously, like, it drives the results, right? So, many of you asking, how did they choose the weights? We're about to find out. JDM, I understand where you're coming from. So you say, I can sort of understand this method. I'm just not convinced unless every other method is equally as dicey. I would say that every other method is also dicey, yeah. We choose W so that the difference between Sweden and the control units is on a number of key predictors of the outcome variable, and the outcome variable itself is minimized in the treatment period, right? Subject to the above convexity constraints. As key predictors, I use GDP per capita, number of motor vehicles, gasoline consumption per capita, and percentage of urban population. The level of GDP per capita is shown in the literature to be closely linked to emissions of greenhouse gases, and OECD countries that are less urbanized have a higher usage of motor vehicles and hence higher emissions from transport. I averaged the 4 key predictors over the 1990 to 1989 period. Finally, to the list of predictors, I add 3 lagged years of CO2 emissions. 1970, 1980, and 1989. The predictors are in turn assigned weights to allow more weight to be given to relatively important predictors of the outcome variable. There are various methods available for selecting the diagonal matrix of predictor weights V, for instance by assigning weights based on empirical findings in the literature on the main drivers of CO2 emissions or cross-validation methods. In this paper, however, V and the vector of country weights W are jointly chosen so that they minimize the mean squared prediction error of the outcome variable over the entire pre-treatment period. Right. All they're saying is, right, they got a whole lot of measures. GDP per capita, urbanization, you know, where's the table? Here. Gasoline consumption per capita, motor vehicles, CO2 from transport in previous years. All of these are good predictors of emissions in the present day. And what they're doing is selecting the countries from this list of 14 countries, weighting them all, anything from 0 to 1, obviously adding up to 1 in total. And they're doing that to try and maximize the predictive power, right, for emissions. So these key predictors, right, are minimized. The difference between Sweden and synthetic Sweden is minimized on these key predictors in this table. GDP per capita, motor vehicles, gasoline consumption per capita. Try and make them as similar as possible using whatever combination of the countries that we can. So that's minimizing the mean squared prediction error, right? Which is just the technical term for what they're doing. Well, Muffety Tuffety, yeah. Okay, so it's interesting you said that. Synthetic Sweden is overfitting. Okay, so this actually is what I was thinking. And yeah, that's a good description, Mouthy Gelstrup. So essentially, they're trying to describe Sweden's metrics as a function of the chosen countries based on their metrics. But this is the problem, right? So if you look at overfitting, I'm pretty sure there's like an XKCD cartoon about this. You'll probably... So overfitting... So just to say, so overfitting, one of the things about overfitting is when you do something like this, you make something fit the data you have, which is like in-sample data. You make it fit the data you have really, really well. One of the issues is that when you get to out-of-sample predictions... Oh yeah, this is it. No, this is it. Yeah, curve fitting methods, right? XKCD. So look. Curve fitting methods and the messages they send. So let's just go to... It's literally this one. This is what I'm talking about when I say overfitting, right? You get this really good fit to the data and it's like smooth little bumps that goes up there. Like that really fits, right? If you... Oh, you can't. If you ignore this bit, that really fits. But then as soon as you get out of sample, it does something wacky because you've got some wacky equation that you're saying explains the data, and it's like, okay, it explains the data in here, but as soon as you start getting out of the data you have, there's too much going on, and you get some crazy kind of thing like this, right? So this is what I'm worried about because this is exactly what we're trying to do. They're not saying it, but we're trying to make an out-of-sample prediction here. We're trying to say what would happen to synthetic Sweden after, in absence of a carbon tax, right? After the carbon tax was emitted, after the carbon tax was implemented. So you see, this is all in sample. My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, please. This is all in sample, but then that is out of sample. That is synthetic Sweden out of sample. So how do we know that it's the effect of the carbon tax, or have we just done this? Have we just overfitted it and now we've got some wacky path for our synthetic Sweden that isn't technically right? Yeah, Ludwig, overfitting is when you use way too many variables. But then what determines too many is like needs to be carefully considered in a particular context. So while there is a limited number of variables, it's still possible that they've overfitted. Although the mean squared error, right? Okay, this is getting too technical. I mean, maybe they haven't. I hope they haven't. Right? I want carbon taxes to work, but like, how good is the mean squared error? Which is the wait, was it mean squared error? Sorry. Mean square prediction error, yeah. Over the entire pre-treatment period. I don't know how good that is at avoiding overfitting that measure. They do have placebo checks, right, though, so let's yeah, let's continue. So Denmark, Belgium, and New Zealand make up three-fourths of synthetic Sweden. Three-fourths? Why not just say three-quarters? Anyway. Didn't they weight synthetic Sweden for minimal error in the GDP, motor vehicle, and urbanization in the full interval? So no, because it's pre-treatment, right? Missions of I averaged the 4 key predictors over the 1980 to 1989 period. Finally, to the list of predictors, I had 3 lagged years. So 1980 to 1989. You wouldn't want to do it pre-treatment, right? You wouldn't want to do it for the whole period because then it would just match all the way, right? So you get no effect of the carbon tax. You see what I'm saying? Sorry, that's actually not the right graph. This one, I mean, it's similar, right? So you get no effect because you'd match it. So they have only matched it here. Otherwise, they'd just be the same. Do you see what I mean? It's fitted. They're fitted together. You can't do it for the whole period. Then you get no effect of the carbon tax. But there are some placebo tests which may be convincing. The effects, yeah. This is just about the effects of a carbon tax, Tyler. Yeah, I agree, Muffety. They should have done an out of sample test. Maybe the placebo test will be a bit like an out of sample test. Arrow, that's a good point. Although this is transportation, so they did have a little section where they said that basically it's cars, so essentially in vehicles, and they can't. The nearest place is Norway, and actually gas is more expensive in Norway, so you can't fill up in other countries. The post-treatment distance between Sweden and synthetic Sweden in Figure 4 measures the reduction in CO2 emissions from the carbon tax. This distance is further visualized in the gap plot of Figure 5. Right. The introduction of the VAT and the gradual increase of the carbon tax create larger and larger reductions during the post-treatment period. In the last year of the sample period, 2005, emissions from transport in Sweden are 12.5% or minus 0.35 metric tons per capita, lower than they would have been in absence of treatment. The reduction in emissions from the 1990 to 2005 period is 10.9% or negative 0.29 metric tons of CO2 per capita in an average year. Aggregating over the total population gives an emission reduction of 3.2 million tons of CO2 in 2005 and an average for the 1990 to 2005 period of 2.5 million tons of CO2. The total cumulative reduction in emissions for the post-treatment period is 40.5 million tons of CO2. Because of the reduction of the energy tax rate in the years 2001 to 2005, the simultaneous increase of the carbon tax rate is almost cancelled out during this period, leaving a nearly flat combined real tax rate. Consequently, we can be more confident in stating that the emission reductions from 1990 to 2000 is due to the introduction of the carbon tax and VAT alone. Whereas for 2001 to 2005, the reductions is due to changes in all three tax components. Okay, so it was only the carbon tax that changed early on. Assuming that a similar reduction in the energy tax rate did not take place in the countries that make up synthetic Sweden. In 2000, the last year before the energy tax was lowered, emissions from transport were reduced by 11.5%, or 3.1 metric tons per capita. To further test the validity of the results, I performed a series of placebo tests: in time, in space, leave one out, and full sample. For the in time test, the year of treatment is shifted to 1970 and 1980, years that are both prior to the actual environmental tax reform. For the two tests, the choice of synthetic control is based only on data from 1960 to 69 and 1960 to 79 respectively. We want to find that the placebo treatment doesn't result in a post-placebo treatment divergence in the trajectory of emissions between Sweden and its synthetic control. A large placebo effect casts doubt on the claim that the result illustrated in figures 4 and 5 is the actual causal effect of the carbon tax and the VAT. Encouragingly, figure 6 shows that no such divergence is found. Okay, so this is kind of guarding against overfitting, right? Because what they're doing is basically what we were saying before. They're just acting like the tax happened when it didn't, right? So 1980 in panel A and 1970, they're fitting the data here, and then they're predicting the difference synthetic Sweden here. And they are quite similar. Now, it's a better fit if you do the tax later because you've got more data. But that's not too bad either. I don't know what the formal tests say. So for the in-space placebo test, wait, okay, but they didn't do formal tests though. There, they just eyeballed it. No such divergence is found, but they need formal tests. For the in-space placebo test, the treatment is iteratively reassigned to every country in the donor pool, again using the synthetic control method to construct synthetic counterparts. This gives us a method to establish if the result obtained for Sweden is unusually large by comparing that result with the placebo results for all the countries in the donor pool. A form of permutation test allows for inference and the calculation of p-values, measuring the fraction of countries with results larger than or as large as the one obtained for the treated unit. Figure 7 shows the results of the in-space placebo test. Panel A indicates that for some countries in the donor pool, the synthetic control method is unable to find a convex combination of countries that will replicate the path of emissions in the pre-treatment period. This is especially true for the United States, Poland, and Portugal, which is not surprising since the United States has the largest CO2 emissions at all during all the pre-treatment years, and Poland and Portugal have the lowest. Therefore, in Panel B, all the countries with a pre-treatment mean square prediction error at least 20 times larger than Sweden's pre-treatment prediction error, mean square prediction error, are excluded, which leaves 9 countries in the donor pool. Now the gap in emissions for Sweden in the post-treatment period is the largest of all remaining countries. The p-value of estimating a gap of this magnitude is thus 0.1. This is like... Yeah, agree, Benstead. Never forget that rent control is good, actually. So this, I'm not familiar with this type of placebo test. I feel that I'm not gonna try and you know, we've done a lot of dense stuff, and I was kind of happy with this placebo test, so I'm kind of confident they're not overfitting. Even so, the choice of a particular cutoff for the MSPE value when doing permutation testing is arbitrary. A better inferential method is to look at the ratio of post-treatment MSPE to pre-treatment MSPE with the assumption that a large ratio is indicative of a true causal effect from treatment. With the ratio test, we do not have to discard countries based on an arbitrarily chosen cutoff rule, and thus the ratio test is advantageous when you have a small number of control units. Figure 8 shows that Sweden by far has the largest ratio of all the countries in the sample. If one was to assign the treatment at random, the probability of finding a ratio this large is 1/15, the smallest possible p-value within my sample size. For the leave one out test, I iteratively eliminate one of the 6 control countries that got a W weight larger than 0.001. To check if the results are driven by one or a few influential controls. As we see from figure 9, the main results are robust to the elimination of one donor pool country at a time. We get slightly larger reductions when we eliminate Denmark, slightly smaller reductions when we eliminate Switzerland or the United States, and basically unchanged results for the others. This test thus provides us with a range for the estimated emissions reduction from an average post-treatment reduction of 13% when eliminating Denmark, to the most conservative estimate of an 8.8% reduction when eliminating Sweden. The average, okay, leave one out, yeah. So you leave one out of synthetic Sweden, and you see if the results are robust to you leaving one out, right? What does that say? The average of the 6 iterations gives an emission reduction 10.4%. Note also that the conservative estimate is still larger than the DAD estimate of an 8.1% reduction. For the last robustness check, I include the full sample of 24 OECD countries when constructing the counterfactual. If we use the entire donor pool and rerun the estimation, the results are nearly unchanged. Oh, okay, so look, this is another encouraging one. So just basically ignore all the reasons to eliminate the OECD countries. Predictor means gap plot and path plot look similar to the main results, albeit with slightly larger emissions reductions in 2004 and 2005. The only previously excluded country that now gets a significant weight is the United Kingdom, with a weight of 0.128. The synthetic control is otherwise composed of Denmark, Belgium, New Zealand, and the United States, with 3/4 of the total weight still given to the first 3 countries. The 2 countries that drop out are Greece and Sweden, which previously... Swedenland? You can tell I've been talking for too long. The 2 countries that drop out are Greece and Switzerland, which previously got a weight of 0.09 and 0.06 respectively. My main criterion for dropping countries from the sample is large changes to fuel taxes during the sample period. Figure 4 shows that emissions in Sweden and its synthetic counterpart track each other closely for the 30 years before the carbon tax reform. This provides suggestive evidence that non-price policies haven't had a significant effect on CO2 emissions from the Swedish transport sector, as otherwise we expect the two series to diverge at some point from 1960 to 1990. Non-price policies can in this context be viewed as unobserved confounders, and an advantage of the synthetic control method is that it relaxes the parallel trends assumption by allowing the effects of unobserved confounders on the outcome variable to vary over time. In any case, the leave one out and full sample tests show that the main results are neither driven by any one country alone, nor that the exclusion of countries from the donor pool impacts the estimated emissions reductions. Okay. Yeah, that was a good placebo as well. So we've got might just read this section looks interesting, or well, worthwhile, about carbon taxes hurting economic growth. A common argument against carbon taxation is that it will hurt economic growth. We also find in the literature clear evidence of a link between GDP growth and growth in CO2 emissions. Could it thus be that the introduction of the carbon tax reduced the level of GDP in Sweden post-treatment, and that this is the actual driver behind the emission reductions? Or alternatively, is the exogenous shock of the domestic financial and economic crisis in the early 1990s driving the results? Yeah, so Sweden had a crisis in the early 90s, so that is potentially a big factor here to consider. Figure 11 shows that GDP per capita in Sweden and its synthetic counterpart track each other quite well during the 30 years before and 16 years after treatment. Yes, there is a reduction in real GDP per capita from 1990 to 1993, which is not matched by a similar reduction in synthetic Sweden. But already by 1995, the two series are closely aligned again. This is kind of a good out-of-sample test as well, actually, just the GDP. If the recession drove the reduction in emissions, we would expect to see a bounce back in emissions once economic growth started to catch up again, but this we do not see. So there's a big crisis, drop in emissions can sometimes happen along with a big crisis, but didn't recover. The economy recovered, but emissions didn't. So we can't say that the reduction in emissions is because of the crisis rather than the carbon tax. The correlation between gaps in GDP per capita and gaps in CO2 emissions from transport between Sweden and its synthetic counterpart is further illustrated in Figure 12. This figure allows us to compare and contrast the impact on emissions from the two major recessions in Sweden during the sample period. The first one during 1976 to 1978, and the second in 1991 to 1993. From the gap plot, we see that the drop in relative GDP from 1975 to 78 and 89 to 93 are similar in magnitude, a decrease of around $2,300 per capita. The impacts on emissions are, however, very different. From 75 to 78, CO2 emissions from transport actually increased with 0.086 tons per capita in Sweden compared to synthetic Sweden, whereas from 89 to 93 they decreased with 0.291 tons. Furthermore, in both cases, the catch-up in growth following the recessions was not met with an increase in relative transport emissions. The comparison of the different effects of the two major recessions provides further evidence that the recession in the early 90s is not the driver of emissions reductions in the post-treatment period. Right. So in previous recessions, emissions actually rose. In conclusion, there is no indication that the domestic recession from 91 to 93 is driving emissions post-treatment, and no observable long-term negative effect on GDP from the environmental tax reform. Average GDP per capita in Sweden during the post-treatment period of 90 to 2005 is 0.1% higher than GDP in synthetic Sweden. Figure 11, together with the gap plot in Figure 5, signals that since the introduction of the carbon tax, the long-run positive correlation between GDP growth and emissions in the transport sector has weakened considerably. This is interesting for degrowth, right? So degrowth has often point to the positive correlation between GDP and emissions, which is definitely there, but this suggests that, I mean, it's a very localized effect, right? It's one country and one sector, but you can maybe sever that link partially with a carbon tax. The positive correlation between GDP growth and emissions in the transport sector has weakened considerably. There is tentative evidence that this holds for the economy as a whole. During 1990 to 2013, total greenhouse gas emissions fell by 23% in Sweden, while real GDP increased by 61%. I don't know if that's consumption or production based though, right? So this is less interesting. I think this is just like really in the weeds of carbon tax versus VAT. Let's go to the discussion because it might... Remember there were loads of studies which showed that there was no effect. So let's, yeah. Let's place this finding of a large reduction in emissions following a carbon tax in Sweden in 1990. Let's place it in the context of other findings in the literature. My results can be compared with previous analyses of the Swedish carbon tax. In Bolin 1998, the author concludes that during 1990 to 1995, the carbon tax had no effect on emissions from the transport sector. I instead find an average emission reduction of 3.6% during 1990 to 95, attributed to the carbon tax, with a reduction in 95 alone of 5.8%. Bolin 1998 states that he doesn't use a modelling approach, and instead relies on ex-post data, but other than using quote, criteria developed by the OECD in 1997, we are not given any detail on the methodology used to, for instance, derive the counterfactual emission levels. It is thus hard to determine why our estimates differ. Okay, this is, in case anybody didn't detect, this is the academic way of saying that this Bolin guy is talking absolute bullshit. Because he doesn't detail what he's done and how he's done it. Lin and Lee adopt a DID framework to estimate reductions in emissions growth rates due to carbon taxation in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and the Netherlands. They find a significant effect for Finland only, a 1.7% reduction in the growth rate of CO2 per capita. There are, however, countries in their control group that are less than ideal when creating the counterfactual emissions, such as Austria, Luxembourg, and Ireland. Furthermore, they use total CO2 emissions as their outcome variable, and hence combine treated and untreated sectors of the economies in their research design. Ah, okay. All countries with carbon taxes have some sectors that are exempted. This approach violates one of the assumptions underlying causal inference and therefore does not provide a true estimate of the environmental efficiency of carbon taxes. Lastly, some of their included covariates such as urbanization level, industry structure, and energy prices are likely themselves affected by the carbon tax and thus also outcome variables. So these are bad controls, right? Including them on the right-hand side of the regression will thus bias the results. So basically these people are not accounting for the fact that the carbon tax only applies to some sectors and they're controlling for bad controls. Yeah, Mufferty, sorry, it's an interesting point. The number of confounders is basically could be limitless. So it is difficult to say you've controlled for confounders completely. Lastly, Sweden's fifth national report on climate change estimates that the reduction of CO2 emissions from the transport sector is 1.7 million metric tons compared with if Sweden had kept taxes at the 1990 level. An important assumption since the tax level then already includes VAT. The emission reduction is simulated by estimating changes in gasoline consumption using price elasticities of demand. Their estimate is markedly lower than my empirical estimate, which shows a reduction of in 2005 of 2.4 million metric tons of CO2 from the carbon tax. Besides assuming that the real gasoline tax stays constant at the 1990 level when calculating their counterfactual, they apply a long-run price elasticity of demand for gasoline of minus 0.8, based on an average from a number of European studies. That I find, using empirical ex post data, an estimate of the emission reduction in 2005 that is 40% larger and a carbon tax elasticity of minus 1.57, around twice the size of the price elasticity they use, shows how simulation analysis may underestimate the effectiveness of carbon taxes. Again, academic analysis for simulation analysis is bullshit. In addition to the empirical finding that the Swedish carbon tax has been environmentally efficient, this paper shows that Swedish consumers exhibit larger behavioural responses to changes to the carbon tax rate compared with equivalent changes to the carbon tax exclusive gasoline price. This finding is similar to some earlier studies of carbon and gasoline taxes. My study is the first, however, to analyse a European market, whereas earlier studies have focused on the United States and Canada, where gasoline taxes are significantly lower. In 2008, excise gasoline taxes in US cents per litre was 120 in Sweden, but only 32 in Canada and 13 in the United States. As a percentage of the overall gasoline price, excise taxes constitutes 61.6% in Sweden, but only 27.5% in Canada and 14.6% in the United States. Yeah, this will be why Canada was omitted, right, from the synthetic control. Consequently, the tax-inclusive gasoline price is much less volatile in Sweden than in the United States and Canada, since the stable and certain part, the excise taxes, make up a larger part of the whole. Because of large differences in consumer prices for gasoline, a, say, 10-cent increase in gasoline taxes will create larger price increases in percentage terms in the United States and Canada than in Sweden, and thus larger relative reductions in consumption, assuming tax elasticities are similar across the three countries. Therefore, one should be careful regarding the external validity of the estimated emission reductions found in this paper. A Swedish-sized carbon tax rate applied to low tax level countries will most likely lead to larger emission reductions than what is found in this paper. Nevertheless, countries that are similar to Sweden will likely experience comparable emissions reductions from the same level of carbon tax. What is important here, though, is the term similar countries. Important predictors of emissions such as the level of GDP, degree of urbanization, and prior level of fuel taxes are variables to take into account when considering the external validity of the results. So, yeah, because taxes are so low in the United States and Canada, you might expect a bigger response if you increase them. Because it's like, so it's a bit like, there's a famous paper on smokers, and they say, right, basically, if you institute cigarette taxes, right, like smoking taxes, then you end up basically targeting all the people at first who aren't that addicted to smoking and maybe smoke socially, or they wanted to give up anyway, or things like that. Right? But then once you've increased cigarette taxes to a certain level, then you've got rid of all of those people, and all you've got left are the massive, like the massive addicts, right, who smoke like 60 a day. And they're not really going to respond to the taxes anymore, right? They have a lower tax elasticity of demand. And therefore, increasing the taxes isn't going to have that big of an effect. Now, that's a similar point to the one they're making here, right? In Sweden, with its already high taxes, everybody who's still driving is like, well, I really need to drive, or I love driving, or I've got the money to afford, paying loads for fuel or whatever. Whereas in somewhere like the Canada and US, they've still got relatively low prices, so you haven't got rid of the people who would be more willing to change. So that's a limitation of this study, but it does suggest that a carbon tax elsewhere may have an even bigger effect. Which is good news, especially in the States where emissions are through the roof. In summary, earlier studies of the environmental efficiency of carbon taxes have had issues with constructing a credible counterfactual, either by including countries in the donor pool that are themselves treated, or including countries that are too dissimilar when it comes to important predictors of CO2 emissions. Combining emissions from treated and untreated sectors of the economy and their outcome variable, the choice of control variables, including bad controls, using price elasticities of demand that underestimate the environmental efficiency of carbon taxes, and not capturing substitutions between different transport fuels or between different modes of transport. The take-home message is thus to think hard about research design as always, and how to find a suitable identification strategy. Using ex-post empirical data on emissions and important predictors of it, together with the synthetic control method, allowed me to capture all possible substitutions made and to recognize those control units that were most suitable for this comparative case study, and ultimately identify the causal effect of the Swedish carbon tax on emissions. Okay, let's finish this paper, everyone. Thanks for staying with me. It's been tough going, but it's been, I think, worth it. And in the end, I wonder what you guys think of the paper. Tell me how convinced you are by it before I tell you my opinion. Conclusion. The Paris Agreement is rightly seen as an important step taken towards the common goal of addressing climate change. To reach the mitigation targets put forward by each country, it is important to rely on environmentally and economically efficient measures such as carbon pricing. This paper shows empirically that a carbon tax can be successful in significantly reducing emissions of carbon dioxide. After implementation of a carbon tax and VAT on transport fuels in Sweden, CO2 emissions from transport declined almost 11% in an average year, with 6% from the carbon tax alone. This result is in contrast to earlier empirical studies that find little to no effect on emissions from carbon taxes. The identification strategy adopted is to carefully construct a control unit that did not implement a carbon tax or similar policies, but had a similar level and trajectory of CO2 emissions before treatment. The control unit, Synthetic Sweden, is able to accurately reproduce the values for Sweden on a number of key predictors of CO2 emissions from the transport sector, and to closely track emissions during the 30 years prior to treatment. Also, the use of empirical data on the outcome variable allows us to capture substitutions made between transport fuels, most notably from gasoline to diesel, as well as substitutions between modes of transport. This is an improvement upon simulation studies that use changes in gasoline consumption as a proxy for total changes in CO2 emissions from transport. The results obtained are furthermore robust to a series of placebo tests. Reassigning the treatment at random in the sample shows that the probability of obtaining a post-treatment result as large as that for Sweden is just 0.067. Lastly, this paper finds that consumers respond more strongly to changes to the carbon tax rate than equivalent market-driven gasoline price changes. The estimated carbon tax elasticity of demand for gasoline is 3 times larger than the price elasticity. This finding has implications for climate change policies in that carbon taxes would be more effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution than previous simulation studies suggest. Future analyses of the economics of climate change thus ought to take into consideration the finding that consumers' response to carbon taxes may be larger than existing estimates of price elasticities of demand indicate. Okay, so what do we think? Yui, we've just solved Marxism, don't know what this paper is about. Yeah, that sounds like chat. That sounds like my usual chat. So carbon pricing for transportation is essentially redundant. Why do you say that? Because there are other taxes which can achieve the same thing. It's a bit confusing for a layman. Provinces, yeah, Canada has provinces. That's one conclusion. I found this paper fairly convincing. In the end, I think they did some good placebo checks. Scythu hates the paper. Look, everyone, it's time for another research document. Where do you bloody center this crap? Ah, search for nothing. Why did that copy and paste there? Honestly. Should say previous literature, right? Previous literature on carbon taxes or carbon pricing has been indecisive on the question of whether emissions substantially. Anderson studies the 1990 implementation of a carbon tax on which largely fell on vehicle use. The Swedish 1990 implementation of a carbon tax which largely fell on vehicle use Let's say investigates. That's a better word. Using a synthetic control method comprised of a comparison of Sweden to a combination of other OECD countries, he finds a, what is it, like a 9%? 11%, sorry. He finds a reduction from transport of 11%. Yeah, that's actually a better word. Google correcting my sentences. So we did that. This is research, everybody. We read that whole paper. Well, we skipped a little bit of it, but we read the whole paper and we got a short paragraph out of it. Bye, help me. have a nice sleep. A short paragraph out of one paper is actually quite a lot. So often you'll get, in fact, I would say the modal paper that you read in research, you probably don't actually, nothing really ends up on directly on your paper that you're writing. I'm going to just add that this critique, but the study is quite convincing in its use of robustness checks. It is also possible that low tax countries like Canada, let's say low fuel tax, because I don't mean low, would experience a larger reduction as they okay. So I do not understand. Yeah, the bots, like, honestly, I've banned like certain things. I might have to Here you are, everybody. You can get to see under the hood. Under the hood of UE. So, spam protection. Now, what I can do is ban excess symbols. Wait. Not symbols. Emotes. Emojis. Now, what that means... What that means is that you guys obviously can't do that. You guys can't do that. So you guys can't use excessive emotes. You won't get banned, it will just get deleted. Right? So I know that there are valid reasons for people to want to do that, right? But yeah, if your heavily emojied message doesn't appear, then you have the bots to blame. They have forced my hand, my regulatory hand. Yeah, Dolphin Expert's right. The advertising's in the name, so like... Yaroslav. Yeah, well, you literally put it at the limit. So if you got 6, elbow cough. So, there you go. Yeah, see, Nightbot's already leapt into action. You idiots. You fell right into Nightbot's trap. All right. So I did like a really quick Google search about carbon taxes. So I'll just have a look at like the abstracts for these. We're not going to read another full paper because we're all tired. With elbow cough. Why can't I see elbow cough? I literally cannot see it. Can other people see that? So, fuel consumption and CO2 emissions from passenger cars in Europe. Yes, fuck cars. Laboratory versus real-world emissions. Official laboratory measured monitoring data indicate a progressive decline in average fuel consumption and CO2 emissions of the European passenger car fleet. There is increasing evidence to suggest that officially reported CO2 values do not reflect the actual performance of the vehicles on the road. A reported difference of 30 to 40% between official values and real-world estimates was found, which has been continually increasing. This paper reviews the influence of different factors that affect fuel consumption and CO2 emissions on the road and in the laboratory. Factors such as driving behavior, vehicle configuration, and traffic conditions are reconfirmed as highly influential. Neglected factors such as side winds, rain, road, grade, which may have significant contributions in fuel consumption in real-world driving, are identified. The margins of the present certification procedure contribute between 10 and 20% in the gap between the reported values and reality. The latter was estimated to be of the order of 40% or 47.5 gigatons of CO2 or CO2 per km. Yeah, gigatons of CO2 per km for the 2015 average fleet emissions, but could range up to 60% or down to 19% depending on prevailing traffic conditions. The introduction of a new test protocol is expected to bridge about half of the present divergence between laboratory and real world. Finally, substantial literature was found on the topic. However, the lack of common test procedures, analysis tools, and coordinated activity across different countries point out the need for additional research in order to support targeted actions for real-world CO2 reduction. Quality. This is a fucking long abstract. Quality checks of the CO2 certification procedure and reported values, combined with in-use consumption monitoring, could be used to assess the gap on a continuous basis. So when people who make cars report their CO2 emissions, they're basically wrong. Due to various factors, potentially lying. I just wonder if this has ever been posted in Fuck Cars. Interesting. It could be an interesting paper for Fuck Cars, but like it's not like it's not worth reading for our purposes. I don't think everybody. Imagine using light mode. Ha. I think I was on dark mode for a bit and then it just fucking changed back. I do need to change it back. But I can't be asked right now. As one of the most cost-effective means of emission reduction, carbon tax has attracted considerable attention from economists and international organisations and has led to a large number of related research. What? Using the bibliometric method, this paper characterises... Oh, this is just like a fucking review of reviews of the literature, not like actually any findings. Where is the carbon tax after 30 years of research? This paper takes a dive into the deep literature on the carbon tax accumulated through active and continuous research over the past 30 years. It also presents the ongoing debate and implementation of the carbon tax in practice. The paper discusses the evolution of the carbon tax literature, classifying it by the issues investigated and methodology used for the investigation. It finds that the literature enlightens 4 key issues: economic impacts, firstly, choices for revenue recycling, secondly, distributional implications, thirdly, and competitive and border tax adjustment, fourthly. Quantitative analysis, especially computable general equilibrium modelling, (CEI), is the main method employed in the literature. The study shows that potential adverse economic impacts and competitiveness concerns are the main impediments to the introduction of the carbon tax. Extensive examinations of carbon tax issues at the global, regional, and country levels have led to innovative measures to address these concerns. While the carbon tax was mainly a subject of academic discussion until a few years back, it has generated good attention for policymakers, particularly after the Paris Agreement on climate change, and is being considered as one of the main market instruments to address global climate change. Although several important issues related to the carbon tax have been well researched, its potential interactions with poverty and shared prosperity are yet to be investigated. This looks like an interesting review. It is 88 pages long. Is this... So it's still a World Bank working paper. I mean, these things don't necessarily get published anyway. But where's the... Do they actually look at the effect on emissions? Because they didn't say that they do. I don't quite... I mean, I obviously need to read the actual paper, but... I mean, I'm getting the sense again. Potentially a bit thin on like whether they actually reduce emissions. We've got that paper we just read, but yeah, like, I don't know. Okay, there's another paper here. Carbon taxes and greenhouse gas emissions trading systems. What have we learned? Systematic evidence relating to the performance of carbon pricing, carbon taxes and greenhouse gas emissions trading systems is sparse. Yes. Thank you. It is sparse. In 2015, ETSs were operational in 55 jurisdictions, while 18 jurisdictions collected the carbon tax. The papers in this special thematic section review the performance of many of these instruments over the 2005 to 2015 period. The performance of existing carbon taxes and GHG ETSs can help policymakers make informed choices about whether to introduce these instruments and to improve their design. The purpose of carbon pricing instruments is to reduce GHG emissions cost effectively. Assessing their performance is difficult because emissions are also affected by other policies and exogenous factors such as economic conditions. Carbon taxes in Europe prior to 2008 and in British Columbia reduced emissions from business as usual, but actual emissions continued to rise. Since 2008, emissions subject to European carbon taxes have declined, but in most countries, other mitigation policies have probably contributed more to the reductions than the carbon taxes. Emissions subject to ETSs, with the exception of 4 systems without emissions caps, have declined. The ETSs contributed to the emissions reductions, but their share of the overall reduction is not known. Most tax rates are low relative to levels thought to be needed to achieve climate change objectives. Few jurisdictions regularly adjust their tax rates. All ETSs have accumulated surplus allowances and have implemented measures to reduce these surpluses. The largest ETSs now specify annual reductions in their emissions caps several years into the future. Emissions trading system allowances prices are generally lower than the tax rates. Yeah, thanks, Dolphin Expert. I should make a Nightbot for the Discord as well. Lots of Nightbots. So this looks like an interesting paper. I think this one is as well, potentially. So we want to compare, right? Carbon taxes may be effective, but we want to compare them to other options like emissions trading schemes, as well as, completely different options like subsidizing renewables and, banning cars and things like that. Yeah, this isn't that long a paper. Interesting. Maybe we can do it. Maybe we should do it. Seems like it might be a half decent overview. It might be a half decent overview. So let's do this paper. That'll be the next paper we do. I'm just gonna BRB for a second. Everyone get a drink, go to the toilet, have a cry, whatever you need to do. Hello. All right, come on, everybody. This is. I think this paper is actually going to be quite readable, and it's going to contrast carbon taxes and emission trading schemes, which is exactly what we want. Introduction. Economists argue that putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pricing, is the most cost-effective regulatory approach to reducing those emissions. A price on greenhouse gas emissions provides an incentive to implement emission reduction options whose mitigation costs are lower than the price. Carbon pricing can be implemented using either of two instruments, a carbon tax or a greenhouse gas emissions trading system, or ETS. With a tax, the government sets the tax rate and specifies the sources subject to the tax. The emission reduction achieved depends on the response of the affected sources to the imposition of the tax. With an emissions trading scheme, the government sets a limit on greenhouse gas emissions by specified sources and distributes allowances approximately equal to the limit. Allowances are tradable. Each source must surrender allowances equal to its actual emissions to the government. Emissions cannot exceed the limit, but the compliance cost depends on the market price of allowances. 1 second, I'm having microphone issues. It's just the positioning. The stand I've got is absolutely terrible. Okay, so yeah. Carbon pricing, you got a tax, you tax it like any other tax. Carbon costs more, and you pay the government. With an emissions trading scheme, you've got like these allowances and set to some total limit, and then people can actually trade them. If they want to emit more, they have to buy them. There is an extensive literature on the relative merits of these two instruments. The debate is waged almost exclusively on theoretical grounds because of the limited information available on the actual performance of these instruments. Let me just download this paper properly. So we can make... what is it, 2018, yeah. The first carbon taxes were implemented in 1990. Hello, Kogel. You're making spaghetti. That sounds very nice. I have some leftover risotto that I made. What should you add to the sauce? Presuming it's tomato sauce. One thing which actually works quite well is soy sauce. A lot of people don't add that, but it makes it quite dark and kind of rich. Not too much. The first carbon taxes were implemented in 1990, while the first mandatory greenhouse gas emissions trading systems became operational in 2002. The number of jurisdictions with a carbon tax and/or a greenhouse gas emissions trading system has increased steadily in recent years. This special thematic section focuses on the actual performance of the instruments in effect at the end of 2015. The focus is on 2005 to 2015. That provides a common time period with at least some operational data. This paper provides a synthesis of the papers in the special thematic section. Deng, Li, Pang, and Zhuan document the implementation of the 7 emissions trading system pilot schemes in China. Wakabayashi and Kimura review the performance of the Tokyo Metropolitan ETS. Narasimhan, Gallagher, Costa, and Alejo assess other ETSs, and Masha reviews the carbon taxes, ETSs, and hybrid systems implemented by Canadian provinces. This paper also draws on other studies for lessons learnt from the implementation of carbon taxation and emissions trading but does not claim to provide a comprehensive review of the extensive literature that exists on carbon pricing. The theoretical design of each instrument is summarized in the next section. The instruments implemented differ from the theoretical design in ways described in Section 3. An overview of the taxes and ETSs in operation at the end of 2015 is provided in Section 4. Assessment criteria are discussed in Section 5. Evidence relating to the performance of carbon taxes in GHG ETSs is presented in Sections 6 and 7 respectively. Section 8 concludes with lessons learned from the performance of these instruments and suggestions for further research. That's basically every academic paper. The conclusion is a conclusion and suggestions for further research. Yeah, soy sauce is nice. Soy sauce is nice. Can you? I didn't expect such reactions from that. Is soy sauce in tomato sauce is good. The theoretical design of each instrument is simple. Actual designs, as discussed in the next section, are more complex. The theory of a carbon tax is that the government designates the emission sources subject to the tax and sets the tax rate per unit of emissions. Economic efficiency is improved by increasing the share of the jurisdiction's total greenhouse gas emissions subject to the tax. Greenhouse gases other than CO2 can be expressed in tons of CO2 equivalents to increase coverage. Okay. Inevitably, some emissions are excluded because they are too difficult or costly to measure, the quantity is too small, or for other reasons. That's an important caveat. Practically, you actually can't always tax carbon. The tax rate can be set in various ways. One option is to set the tax rate equal to the estimated benefit of reducing GHG emissions by 1 ton of CO2, the so-called social cost of carbon. That's something somebody mentioned early on in this stream. Another option is to set the tax rate at a level that yields a target emissions reduction based on economic modelling. Other options are to set that tax rate at a level similar to that of other jurisdictions or at a level that generates a desired amount of tax revenue. Regardless of the level selected, the tax rate may be phased in over time. To maintain its effectiveness or generate further emission reductions, the tax rate needs to be adjusted regularly for the effects of inflation, increases in real income, technological change, and other factors such as changes in fossil fuel prices. Most GHG emission reduction measures involve an investment. Tax rates specified several years into the future facilitate those investment decisions. The most prevalent form of emissions trading scheme, a cap and trade system, imposes a government-established limit on aggregate GHG emissions by specified sources, distributes tradable allowances, usually 1 ton of CO2 equivalent each, approximately equal to the limit, and requires regulated emitters to surrender allowances equal to their actual emissions. Allowances are distributed free based on allocation rules and by auction. The number of allowances distributed may be less than the established limit because some allowances may be withheld for purposes such as allocations to new entrants or because they are not purchased at allowance auctions. Allowances in excess of the cap may be distributed as transitional mechanisms or to limit price increases when allowance prices exceed specified thresholds. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, soy sauce is great. That is the one conclusion from this stream. A less common form of ETS, a baseline and credit system, specifies an emissions limit for each participant and allocates tradable credits to emitters whose actual emissions are less than their limit. Emitters that exceed their limit can purchase credits to cover the excess emissions from other participants. The term allowance will be used to include the credits in such systems. Under both forms, the market determines the price for allowances and thus the price per ton of CO2 emitted. An ETS must be large enough to create a competitive market for allowances. That means numerous participants with none large enough to dominate the market. In a cap and trade system, the government established aggregate cap is usually a reduction from the recent emissions level or trend for the sources covered. In a baseline and credit system, the emissions limit for each participant can be absolute or based on production and an emissions intensity. In effect, the emissions limit is a free allowance allocation to the participant, and the aggregate cap is the sum of the participant's emissions limits. As with a tax, economic efficiency is improved by increasing the share of total greenhouse gas emissions covered by the ETS, but inevitably some emissions are excluded. To generate further reductions, the aggregate cap must decline over time. Combustion of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The emissions can be determined accurately from the carbon content of the fuel, which is well defined for each fuel. This means that the emissions due to combustion of fossil fuels can be regulated based on the carbon content of each fuel as it enters the jurisdiction's economy rather than at the point of combustion. That reduces the number of entities covered by the tax or ETS dramatically. A tax and an ETS both generate revenue, the latter mainly from auctioned allowances. The revenue is generally used for one or more of the following purposes: financing mitigation and adaptation impacts of the instrument on low-income groups, that's important, providing rebates to energy-intensive trade-exposed firms, reducing existing taxes and general revenues. Commitments relating to the use of the revenue may be important for gaining public support for the instrument. When evaluating the impacts of a tax or ETS, some analyses include the use of the revenue, while others ignore the revenue-related impacts. And it is, so carbon taxes obviously raise revenue, whereas ETSs don't necessarily. If you just give them away, they don't. And I don't think you should give them away. So that's where auction design can come in handy, right? I never put Marmite in sauces or broth. I don't think I do, but I would potentially. I'd have to think about what exactly to put in it. Do I support nuclear energy? Yes, essentially I do. Yeah, that's definitely something that we'll be looking at in the future. So botched mandala. Why did Pigou think Pigouvian taxes would work? I think they do to some extent. Like literally the paper we just looked at showed that carbon taxes work. Yeah, sin taxes also work. They tend to reduce consumption of alcohol and things. Okay, let's continue. Greenhouse gases have some properties that can affect the implementation of a tax or ETS. Most greenhouse gases have long atmospheric residence times, 100 years or more for many of the gases, and are stock pollutants, meaning that the impacts depend on the cumulative stock in the atmosphere rather than current emissions. That means current emissions have global impacts for 100 years or more, which complicates estimation of the social cost of carbon. And to stabilize the atmospheric stock of GHGs, global emissions must be reduced to virtually zero. Under highly restrictive assumptions, a carbon tax and an ETS yield identical results for equivalent emission reductions. These assumptions include perfect foresight, no uncertainty relating to the future, perfect competition in all markets, no interaction with other policies, and universal coverage of all sources of GHG emissions. In practice, the assumptions needed for theoretical equivalence do not hold, so the real-world performance of a carbon tax and an ETS is likely to differ. Well, there you go, everybody. Obscenely unrealistic economic models aren't a very good guide to real-world policy. Yeah, they are regressive, Botch Mandala, but then you can have a dividend, right? So you could literally redistribute the money to people. Tree Brain, well, yeah, it was about mostly a paper on carbon taxes being quite effective. They're certainly not everything. Like a reduction in emissions of 10% is like very good, but obviously you want them to, like he just said, the IPCC suggested it should be reduced to roughly zero. In a given jurisdiction, various factors including constitutional provisions, international commitments, the emissions profile, the ability to create a competitive allowance market, compatibility with the instruments of neighbouring jurisdictions, the influence of large emitters, public opinion, and the government's need to raise revenue can affect the choice and design of an instrument. Thus, the designs of carbon taxes and GHG ETSs implemented vary across jurisdictions. All jurisdictions that implement a tax or GHG ETS include provisions to protect EITE firms, is that energy-intensive trade-exposed firms, against adverse economic impacts from competitors in jurisdictions with no or less costly GHG emissions regulations. Failure to protect EITE firms may lead to lower output and loss of employment in the jurisdiction with the tax or ETS and higher emissions elsewhere, a problem known as leakage. In the case of tax, protection takes the form of tax exemption, a lower tax, or rebates. In the case of ETS, it takes the form of free allowances or rebates. Every jurisdiction with a tax or ETS also has other policies that directly or indirectly affect the GHG emissions of sources subject to the instrument. Some policies, such as incentives for renewable energy and energy efficiency standards for appliances, buildings, equipment, and vehicles, have a direct impact on GHG emissions. Other policies, such as regulations to limit SO2 emissions by coal-fired generating stations and revenue-generating taxes on energy, have incidental effects on GHG emissions. Other policies can distort the impacts of an ETS and make it difficult to assess the effectiveness of carbon pricing instruments. Every carbon tax in GHG ETS includes some emission sources. Is there supposed to be a slash there? Oh no, sorry, no. Some jurisdictions, almost exclusively ETS jurisdictions, allow specific excluded sources to earn credits for verified emission reductions. For example, reduced emissions due to changes in agricultural practices or carbon sequestration through forestry. Such credits can be used for compliance by sources subject to the ETS, but typically with quantitative limits. Less than 10% of the compliance obligation, for example. Eligible credits may be restricted to domestic sources or include those from other jurisdictions. Yeah, so this carbon sequestration, I mean, this is something that's quite controversial, right? It's like, oh, I'm allowed to emit more because I planted trees, but it's like, well, the time frame of emissions and tree planting, you know, the absorption from planting trees and the damage that emissions do, they're over completely different timescales. I'm not a big fan of carbon sequestration. I don't think that it should be allowed, really. It's like you reduce emissions, right? Don't like say, oh, you know, I've reduced emissions because I've planted a load of trees. You have to actually reduce them. It's a bit like saying, I don't know, like, oh, I was still eating loads and loads of sweets and cake, but I'm like going for more runs. It's like, well, too much sugar is still bad for you, right? You can't just like, you can't offset things entirely. These things are incommensurable. They operate in different ways over different time periods. It can be difficult to distinguish a carbon tax from other taxes on fossil fuels, such as excise taxes. Almost all jurisdictions impose some taxes on fossil fuels. Since the carbon content of each fuel is well specified, any tax on a fossil fuel can be expressed as a tax per tonne of CO2. A carbon tax typically imposes the same tax per tonne of CO2 on multiple fuels and or emitting activities. So this is exactly the paper that we just looked at, right? It's difficult to disentangle these different things, and that is one thing that the paper did quite well. The instruments implemented are sometimes hybrids, incorporating features of a tax and an emissions trading system. For example, an emission trading system with an allowance price equal to the specified minimum or maximum is similar to a carbon tax. Yeah, so you can basically just end up charging people for using carbon directly with an ETS, which is basically a carbon tax. A GHG ETS raises several design issues in addition to the level of the cap. Allowances are distributed using a mix of free allocation and auctions. With experience, the share of allowances auctioned has increased. Free allocations tend to be limited to EITE participants, those are the energy intensive trade exposed, and those free allocations tend to be based on performance standards and actual output rather than historic emissions. To encourage early mitigation action, almost all emission trading schemes allow surplus allowances to be banked for future compliance use. To assuage fears of very high allowance prices, most ETSs incorporate price stability provisions. These could include increased use of credits and release of additional allowances at specified levels up to a price ceiling. CCS is carbon capture and storage. Right. Short interlude to change the Nightbot. It's going down to 3. Going down to 3 emojis, unfortunately. Sorry, everyone. Powell, the short answer is that it's not very good for the algorithm when people, because a few, relatively, even if this were public on my main channel, relatively few people are obviously going to watch this compared to my normal videos, and then that's punished by the algorithm. So, the carbon taxes and greenhouse gas ETSs, operational as at the end of 2005 listed in Table 1, are the focus of the analysis here because data on the performance of the more recently implemented instruments are not available. Fair enough, too recent. Most of these instruments are discussed in the papers of this special thematic section. 17 ETSs were operational in 55 jurisdictions, 34 national and 21 subnational, while 17 national and 1 subnational jurisdiction collected a carbon tax. Thus, ETSs are more common even though they are predated by several carbon taxes. So let's take a little look at Table 1. Finland, Poland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Slovenia launched carbon taxes. Estonia, Latvia, British Columbia, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Ireland, Iceland, Japan, United Kingdom, France, Mexico, Portugal. Share of jurisdictions emissions covered. UK 25%. Megatons of CO2 127. Japan's is pretty hefty, right? Greenhouse gas emissions trading systems, European Union, Guangdong province in China, Shanghai, quite a few Chinese provinces or cities. RGGI USA. It's interesting that even the most aggressive ones don't have 100% coverage, right? So you got like British Columbia carbon tax on 70% emissions. These trading systems are lower. Although California, Quebec, 85%. Yeah, so emissions trading systems are like younger. So, yeah, ETSs are more common, but carbon taxes are younger. Over 658 million tons of CO2 annual emissions covered by carbon price covered by a carbon price. ETSs cover 4,280 megatons of CO2, while carbon taxes cover 1,778 megatons of CO2. The number of jurisdictions with a carbon pricing instrument has doubled over the past decade. Including instruments implemented after 2015, they cover 20 to 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The average share of a jurisdiction's emissions covered by an ETS is a little higher than the average for a carbon tax. The share of emissions covered ranges from 18% to 85%, and from 3% to 70% for ETSs, and from 3% to 70% for carbon taxes. So slightly higher for ETSs. I wonder why that is. As shown by Table 1, as of August 2017, the average tax rate is over 50% higher than the average ETS allowance price. Tax rates range from less than $1 to 140 US dollars, while ETS prices range from less than $1 to 24 US dollars per ton of CO2. The revenue generated by these instruments in 2013 was almost 20 billion US dollars. 13 billion by carbon taxes and 6.5 billion by ETSs. By 2017, it had increased to $32 billion, 21 billion by taxes and 11 billion by ETSs. Use of the revenue varies widely by jurisdiction. Overall, tax revenue is used for green spending, general revenue, and tax cuts and direct rebates. The corresponding shares for ETS auction revenue are 70% green spending, 21% general revenue, and 9% tax cuts and rebates. It is interesting to note that apart from Japan and Mexico, all of the jurisdictions with a carbon tax also have an ETS, although they usually cover different emission sources. 13 of the countries with the carbon tax participate in the EU ETS. Switzerland and Alberta also have both a tax and an ETS. British Columbia has established a trading system to complement its carbon tax, but currently there are no emitters subject to the trading system. So more revenue raised. It seems like green spending is much more common for the ETS, and even with the lower revenues, you get much more green spending from an ETS, right? So I'm wondering why that is. The credits are auctioned off. That's right, Dolphin Expert, exactly. The initial credits are auctioned off. Assessing performance. Section 5. The purpose of a carbon tax or GHG ETS is to reduce GHG emissions cost effectively. Thus, these instruments should be assessed on the basis of the emission reductions achieved and the cost per ton of CO2 reduced. Tax rates and allowance prices are readily available as shown in Table 1, but the impact on emissions must be estimated. Other aspects of the performance of these instruments include low price volatility, price commitment into the future, harmonization of marginal costs across jurisdictions, revenue raised, potential cross-jurisdiction revenue flows, and administrative issues. In addition, a jurisdiction implementing a carbon tax or GHG ETS may be concerned about, inter alia, employment, income distribution, regional impacts, economic growth, and technology development. While those are interesting and important issues, the primary focus here is on emissions reductions achieved. Yes. Virtually all published estimates of emissions reductions achieved by carbon taxes and greenhouse gas ETSs calculate the reduction from business as usual emissions projected using econometric methods, models, or control groups. Although ex post projections of business as usual emissions can incorporate actual weather, fuel prices, economic activity, and other factors, they remain projections, so the calculated reductions are only estimates of the actual reductions. So this is an important caveat. These might be a whole load of crap, basically. If we follow the paper that we just read, then these might be a whole load of crap. A more stringent criterion proposed by one study is a reduction from the actual emissions during the first year the instrument was in force. The rationale is that most jurisdictions that have implemented a carbon tax and or GHG ETS have an emissions target that requires a reduction of actual emissions. Since emissions subject to the tax or ETS are verified, the actual emissions during the first year are a more reliable baseline than an estimate of business as usual emissions. Implementation of energy efficiency measures, switching to less emissions intensive fuels and shifting to less emissions intensive products are expected and desired responses to a carbon tax or GHG ETS. Other policies, such as energy efficiency programs, also promote such adjustments perhaps differently across emissions sources subject to the pricing instrument. Some policies, such as fossil fuel subsidies, may inhibit the desired adjustment by some sources. Thus, it is often difficult to disentangle the impact of the carbon pricing instrument from the effect of other policies. Okay, so how are they doing? How well do these carbon taxes work? The performance of carbon taxes. Estimates of the emissions reductions achieved by carbon taxes are available for the BC carbon tax and European carbon tax. That's British Columbia, I'm assuming. At the time of writing, 7 estimates of the impact of the BC carbon tax have been published. All relate to the 2007 to 2012 period when the tax rate was rising at $5 Canadian dollars per tonne of CO2 per year. The effect of the tax was to reduce fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions 5 to 15% from business as usual. Actual emissions subject to the tax increased during this period and continued to increase during the next 5 years, while the tax was constant at $30 per tonne of CO2. So overall emissions actually increased even after the tax. That's different to what happened in Sweden, right? With this carbon tax, because this is the actual. So going back to the previous paper. Oh no, sorry, this is gasoline use, not emissions. Yeah, but gasoline use declined after the VAT and carbon tax were introduced. But also, I think it did say that emissions in total in Sweden declined. At the time of writing, 5 main studies had estimated the emissions reductions achieved by carbon taxes in one or more European countries for different periods prior to 2008. These studies differ in terms of the countries considered to have a carbon tax. All of them include Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, while some studies include Austria, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom, and others do not. So there's dispute over what actually counts as a carbon tax, basically. The studies find that carbon taxes yielded only small reductions, up to 6.5% over several years, from business as usual emissions. The GHG emissions of those countries continued to rise. In a few countries, the introduction of the carbon tax was accompanied by a reduction of existing energy taxes. The small impact reflects extensive tax exemptions, reductions for energy-intensive trade-exposed sources, the low incremental tax burden on fuels, and relatively inelastic demand for fuels in the sectors where the tax was implemented. So they've barely got any bite, these carbon taxes. They've barely got any bite at all. 14 countries that participate in the EU ETS have a carbon tax, while 16 do not. Since the carbon taxes are applied almost exclusively to non-ETS emissions, changes in non-ETS emissions can be compared for countries with and without a tax. Between 2008 and 2015, non-emissions trading scheme emissions declined more rapidly in countries without a carbon tax than in those with a carbon tax. That's weird. Well, it's not that weird. Yeah, this suggests other policies may have contributed more than carbon taxes to reducing non-ETS emissions. Data on taxed emissions are available for 7 countries. Only in Denmark and Switzerland have taxed emissions declined more rapidly than non-ETS emissions. In short, actual emissions subject to carbon taxes have declined in European countries since 2008. But with a few possible exceptions, much of the decline is likely due to non-tax policies. Why have carbon taxes not been more effective? There are at least 2 reasons. The tax rates are too low, and tax rate changes are uncertain. Tax rates are low relative to the social cost of carbon and relative to the prices of the tax fuels. Estimates of the social cost of carbon vary widely for a variety of theoretical and practical reasons. Only the tax rates in Finland, Liechtenstein, Sweden, and Switzerland exceed the carbon price thought to be needed in 2020 to hold the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, in line with the Paris Agreement. In most European countries, the carbon taxes have been less than 15% of the retail price of diesel fuel and have been less than fluctuations in the retail price, so the tax may be lost in the noise of price changes. Apart from periods of 3 to 5 years when a tax is introduced, few jurisdictions regularly adjust their rates. Carbon taxes are applied mainly to transportation fuels and fossil fuels used for residential, commercial, and institutional heating. The taxes are intended to provide an incentive to reduce consumption and adopt less emissions-intensive technologies. But vehicles and equipment have lives of 10 to 20 years, so the adjustment is gradual. Regular adjustments to the tax rate are needed to sustain the incentive to invest in lower-emitting technologies. So they're just low tax rates. There's quite a lot of exemptions. They're not necessarily increasing over time. So, carbon taxes overall, they haven't had a noticeable impact, right? They haven't had a noticeable impact on emissions because of this problem. Now, we've already established that a carbon tax may well work in the areas to which it applies if implemented properly, but in practice, they've been so full of holes that there's not been that much of a reduction in emissions where they've been implemented. The performance of greenhouse gas emissions trading schemes. Data on aggregate emissions are available for many GHG ETSs. The exceptions are the 7 Chinese pilot programs that do not disclose emissions data, and the Korean system where results for the first compliance period are not yet available. Quebec reports compliance with the cap for its 2013 to 2014 compliance period. Data on emissions reductions during its 2015 to 2017 compliance period, which features significantly broader coverage, are not available. California achieved annual emissions reductions of 4.81% during 2013 to 14 and 2.79% for the first 2 years of its 2015 to 2017 compliance period. To meet the state's emissions reduction target, a number of policies, including a renewable portfolio standard, low carbon fuel standard, and energy efficiency measures, were implemented in conjunction with the ETS. Together, those policies cover about 80% of the emissions subject to the second phase of the emissions trading scheme. The ETS was intended to be a backstop in case the other policies did not achieve the anticipated reductions. Estimates of the share of the reductions attributable to the ETS are not available. I mean, it's funny because when, obviously we've kind of gone a level up in terms of abstraction here, right? So the previous study was very in-depth on carbon taxes. This is more of an overview with more casual empirics. But it's interesting that basically what they're saying is that California seems to have just thrown a whole mess of crap at the problem and been like, okay, well, now we've seen a reduction in emissions. Now, it's not massive. Clearly, more could be done. But what I'm saying is we should definitely throw a whole bunch of crap at the problem. I can't see that much harm in doing that. Like, it's not going to increase emissions, is it? The Tokyo and Saitama ETSs claim emission reductions, but actual emissions may have increased. The ETSs assume a constant carbon intensity for electricity, which accounts for a large share of the emissions covered. The Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of 2011 led to the gradual shutdown of all nuclear generating stations and greater reliance on fossil-fired generation. The effect of the increased carbon intensity of electricity on actual emissions cannot be calculated. So much cannot be calculated here. The New Zealand ETS has achieved only minimal reductions from business as usual emissions due to regulatory uncertainty and the ability to use unlimited quantities of low-cost imported units for compliance. Emissions under Alberta's specified gas emitters regulation increased between 2007 and 2015, in part due to higher output by participants and an increase in the number of installations subject to the regulation. Actual emissions by electric power plants covered by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the USA have declined faster than the emissions cap, with the consequence that about 40% of the allowances available at auctions between June 2012 and December 2012 were not sold at the specified minimum price. Okay. So that's actually kind of good news. Lower natural gas prices, other mitigation policies, and the 2008 to 2009 recession contributed to the reductions. Among the other mitigation policies are energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives funded by RGGI allowance auction revenue. The ETS is estimated to be responsible for about half of the emission reductions by fossil-fired generating plants in RGGI states between 2009 and 2012. Part of the reduction may have been offset by higher emissions in neighbouring states. Despite an abundant supply of, and consequent low prices for, allowances, emissions by sources subject to the Swiss emissions trading system have declined. The situation is aggravated by uncertainties related to banking of surplus allowances and the possible link with the EU ETS, now agreed. It is not surprising that the EU emissions trading scheme, the oldest and largest GHG ETS, has been the subject of numerous evaluations. Is that Daniel Fujiwara? Oh, that's actually, he's pretty good, so maybe... Oh no, it's a different Fujiwara, but that, still... Oh, 404 not found, for God's sake. Right, what is it called? Meta-analysis of... Come on. Can I get it? Maybe. We'll look another time. Okay. The studies use a variety of methodologies and span different periods. Some apply to the emissions trading scheme as a whole, while others are limited to a single country. The studies indicate that the ETS reduced emissions by a total of 130 to 247 megatons of CO2 relative to business as usual during its first phase, from 2005 to 2007. The reductions appear to have been achieved mainly through fuel switching and efficiency measures in the power sector, with limited contributions by the industrial sectors. Emission reductions during the second phase from 2008 to 2012 were larger, with industrial facilities contributing to the results. The impacts of other policies and economic developments make it very difficult to estimate the share of the reductions attributable to the emissions trading scheme during this period. In 2008, the EU implemented policies to achieve a 20% share of total energy consumption from renewable energy and a 20% improvement in energy efficiency by 2020. The recession in 2008 to 2009 and the changes to relative prices of coal and natural gas also affected emissions. The only attempt to estimate the share of emission reductions attributable to ETS is inconclusive. Analyses that compare emissions of ETS participants with those of smaller plants in the same country not covered by the ETS suggest the ETS contributed to the 6% emission reduction achieved over the 2008 to 12 period. The renewable energy policies implemented by EU member states reduced power sector emissions, thus reducing the price of allowances and increasing the supply available to industrial sources. In summary, actual emissions have declined in the jurisdictions that have ETSs for which data are available, with the exception of Alberta and New Zealand, which do not cap emissions, and possible small increases in Tokyo and Saitama due to the nuclear plant shutdowns. However, only rough estimates are available of the respective contributions of the ETS, the 2008-2009 recessions, changes in relative fuel prices, and other emission reduction policies. In every ETS, emissions have fallen faster than the cap, leading to the accumulation of a bank of surplus allowances. The banks range in size from 15% to over 500% of the annual compliance obligation. Large banks depress allowance prices. To reduce the size of the banks, most ETSs have cancelled allowances and restricted the use of offset credits and banked allowances. Good. As well, many ETSs now have declining annual emissions caps and market stability reserves. These reserves withdraw allowances from the market when the supply is abundant and release allowances if shortages arise. They are relatively new features and their effectiveness has yet to be demonstrated. So it's like a central bank for emissions trading schemes, basically. So again, as with bloody carbon taxes, it's like, we're not sure. The evidence is really poor on these. One thing that does seem to be clear for ETSs is that they require some prediction of carbon emissions that very rarely seems to come true. So they end up misfiring. It seems historically they overestimate emissions, but sometimes they might underestimate it. So that's what's led to this kind of central bank for ETSs. It is amazing how crap the evidence behind some policy is, isn't it? Really incredible. Okay, final section, final page. Lessons learned and further research. Carbon taxes and greenhouse gas emissions trading schemes have become increasingly popular as policies to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and they now cover over 20% of global emissions. ETSs have expanded more rapidly than carbon taxes. The choice of instrument and its design are affected by circumstances specific to the jurisdiction, including its emissions profile, constitutional provisions, and political considerations. Many of the carbon taxes are in European countries that also have an ETS, generally covering different emission sources. Carbon taxes and GHG ETSs have both demonstrated that they can reduce emissions from business as usual. Reductions in actual emissions subject to a tax, or ETS, are less common and are attributable, at least in part, to the impacts of other mitigation policies and exogenous factors such as changes in fossil fuel prices and economic conditions. The British Columbian carbon tax and European carbon taxes prior to 2008 reduced emissions from business as usual, but actual emissions continued to rise. After 2008, emissions subject to European carbon taxes have declined, but in most countries, other mitigation policies probably contribute more to the reductions than the carbon taxes. Emissions subject to ETSs, with the exception of the 4 systems without emissions caps, Alberta, New Zealand, Saitama, and Tokyo, have declined. While there is evidence that ETS has contributed to the emissions reductions, it's not the share that can be attributed to the ETS as compared to other mitigation policies and its external factors is not clear. The emission reductions by ETSs are achieved with allowance prices that are generally lower than the tax rates. Almost all current tax rates are low relative to the social cost of carbon and as a share of fuel prices. Other mitigation policies and external factors contribute to the difference between tax rates and allowance prices. They do not affect tax rates, but they reduce emissions subject to ETSs, thus leading to allowance surpluses and lower allowance prices. The smaller emission reductions with higher marginal costs for carbon taxes may reflect the sources to which carbon taxes and GHG ETSs are applied. Carbon taxes tend to apply fossil fuels with limited coverage of energy and industrial sources, while the opposite is true for ETSs. The low price elasticity of demand for fossil fuels means that a reduction of the associated emissions may require higher carbon prices and take longer than energy and industrial emissions reductions. So they reckon that people don't respond that much to these taxes, but bear in mind that the study we've seen before this one suggests that actually they do, and maybe more so than these guys are estimating, because this was after this one. I don't know if it references it as... No. So maybe they're underestimating the effectiveness of a carbon tax. Uncertainty relating to the future of the instrument or the carbon price reduces the effectiveness of these instruments. Most mitigation actions involve an investment. A predictable price signal several years into the future facilitates those investment decisions. Several ETSs now specify annual reductions in the emissions cap, and where applicable to the floor price, for periods of 3 to 8 years in legislation or regulations. Apart from a 3 to 5 year period when a carbon tax is introduced, governments rarely specify future tax rates. Thus, emissions trading schemes often create a more stable investment environment than carbon taxes. Okay. But they just admitted that they're often out of whack. The allowances are often out of whack, which what actually happens to emissions. So I don't know that it is. Maybe it's more stable for investment. Now, okay, so new ETSs, okay, so maybe, yeah. I don't know though, but if a carbon tax is also predictable, then surely it would also be as stable. Designs of emissions trading schemes have evolved based on experience, while there has been virtually no change to the design of carbon taxes. Right, this is what I was talking about just now. ETSs have increased the share of allowances auctioned, adopted declining emissions caps, specified future caps and floor prices, shifted to benchmarking for free EITE, energy intensive trade exposed allowances, reduce the accessibility to foreign offset credits, and establish market stability reserves. Experience has been shared bilaterally and via dedicated institutions, including the International Carbon Action Partnership, Western Climate Initiative and Partnership for Market Readiness. Western Climate Initiative and Partnership for Market Readiness. Hey, use an Oxford comma, bro. In contrast, carbon tax jurisdictions still struggle with setting and adjusting the tax rate, and there is little evidence of shared learning based on experience. Right, so carbon taxes need to wisen the fuck up, basically, is what that paragraph is saying. Experience suggests that it may be more appropriate to view carbon taxes and GHG ETSs as components of a portfolio of mitigation policies rather than as alternative first best policies. Yes, virtually every jurisdiction with a tax also has an ETS, and every jurisdiction with a tax or ETS also has other policies to reduce emissions by sources subject to the tax or ETS. There are sound theoretical and practical reasons for using multiple price and non-price instruments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the use of multiple instruments increases the compliance cost and creates complex and interactive and distributional effects. Research into the composition of effective policy portfolios to reduce GHG emissions is needed. I like that. Wait, there may be... Okay. So when we write this up, which we're about to do, there you go. There's the document in the chat, by the way, everyone. So, hates. Whoops. Hates 2018 emphasizes the large degree of uncertainty surrounding... No, not with a Z. I'm not American, right. Emphasizes the large degree of uncertainty surrounding Wait, it's not Hades. Did that just correct to Hades? Okay. Hates? I don't know how to say that. You're all used to me not knowing how to say names though. ETS better than carbon tax as of now? I don't... Maybe. It's really difficult to say. Has been more innovation in how to adapt the policy to various challenges than carbon taxes. Having said that, most of the evidence in the literature is far too uncertain to say any one approach is superior. He gives us the following sensible conclusion. Okay. This is that needs to be here. So future topics. Fuck cars. Resource and mineral extraction. Nuclear power. And what else came up today? I mean, there's plenty to add. There's plenty to add to this, right? Well, no, not degrowth. Let's not do degrowth because that's not a direct policy. Not a direct policy question. We'll leave that for now. But yeah, okay. So we've got the beginnings of a little climate change research document. It's nowhere near where the cost of living one is, which, as we know, is very good. It's in a very nice place. But yeah, that's yeah, I reckon 2 papers is enough. Well done, everybody who managed to stay the whole part-time, or even to people who only managed to stay for half of it or a quarter of it. Yeah, but yeah, it's good. What's this? Oh, table of solutions. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a good, thank you for that. Thank you for that, 5R Nanitis. Anyway, let's all go and eat and lie down and stuff. I'm so hungry, but I'll see you all later. Thanks as usual, everyone. Bye.